What if there was a secret gospel of Jesus hidden from the world? Well, you may know about the Gospel of Thomas, the secret book of Mary Magdalene, or even the Gospel of Judas Iscariot, all of which are Gnostic texts that reimagine certain aspects of Jesus' life and teachings. But how much of what we believe about Jesus is actually found in these early texts? And what if a gospel existed that no church dared to preach? One that never mentioned Peter, never praised Rome, and never called Jesus the Son of David, but still claimed a Messiah had come. What if that gospel was older than Matthew, stranger than Thomas, and buried for 2,000 years in a jar of dust and linen? This is the author, and this is the story of the lost gospel written on papyrus. Imagine yourself in 1945 when World War II has just ended. You're an American soldier stationed in the Egyptian city of Qumran, near the Dead Sea, where for centuries people have been collecting scrolls and books. It's common knowledge that many important Jewish texts have been found here, but no one expects anything more to be found because everything worth taking has already been taken. So you and your comrades go down to the caves to see if anything remains and find a jar made of clay buried inside a linen cloth at the bottom of a cave. The jar contains a leather pouch with several pieces of papyrus inside. The papyrus were carefully rolled and tied together. You untie the leather and unroll the first scroll, and it reads, "And it came to pass in the 2nd year of Artaxerxes, who was king over the kingdom of Aram, that came into his temple one day and said, I will search for the book of the generations of David King Messiah." Instantly, you realize that you've stumbled upon something very important. This is an ancient text, possibly dating back to the time of Jesus himself, and it seems to tell the story of King David and the Messiah. Fast forward to today, and we discover that this isn't just one scroll, but 11, known as the Damascus document, a collection of writings from the sectarian group known as the Community of Qumran, also known as the Essenes. Now, we don't know exactly when these scrolls were written, but we do know they were written before the destruction of Second Temple in 70 CE. This means that the earliest of these texts could be around 2,000 years old. So let's take a closer look at the text itself. The first section we just read comes from what scholars call column 1 of the Damascus document. It continues by saying, "And he said unto them, Wherefore seek ye among the sons of men, and among the children of Israel, the book which is in my house? Then went forth one of those that stood by him, and said, I will go now and seek in the house of El the son of Hezekiah, for it is found among the ancients in the house of the sons of Aaron." For those who don't know, Aram was a kingdom that controlled parts of modern-day Syria and Israel. So why would someone be searching for a book in the Temple of Aram? We'll get to that later. First, let's move on to what's called column 3, where we hear, "And it came to pass after these things that messianic King David came with his men to bless the Lord, to praise him, and to speak before him." Finally we hear, "And the Lord spoke unto David, and said, David, son of Jesse, why dost thou come to me? And David answered and said, I have come before thee, to praise thee, and to bless thee." Here we hear mention of Messiah King David. Scholars say this may be referring to a messianic banquet celebrated by the sect, but the language used here is strikingly similar to the way Jesus is addressed in the Bible. In both cases, he is referred to as the Son of David, and in both cases, he enters a holy place and speaks with God. However, unlike the biblical account, the community of Qumran didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. They believed someone else would come to fulfill that role, and they believed that this figure would come not from David's physical lineage, but rather from Aaron, the brother of Moses. So why would they refer to this person as the son of David? Let's keep going. In section 6, we hear, "And David said unto him, Speak unto me, O Lord, and I will hear and observe all thy word, that I may do it." Now, in this section, the identity of the speaker changes, and scholars believe that this may be the moment when the original author breaks character to include their own commentary. The author says, David said, and we can assume he meant the Messiah, "Speak to me, O Lord, and I will hear and observe all your words that I may do it." This shows us that this group was expecting a coming Messiah who would follow God's word perfectly. This was a common belief among many Jewish sects at the time, but the author makes it clear that this Messiah would not be a descendant of David. Instead, they would be a member of the Aaronic priesthood, chosen by God for their faithfulness. But remember, this isn't a gospel. These are just a few passages taken from a larger work. So let's keep reading. In section 7, we hear, "And David said unto him, Speak unto me, O Lord, and I will hear and observe all thy words, that I may do them faithfully." Again, we see a change in tone, and the author says, "He said," meaning David, "Speak to me, O Lord, and I will hear and observe all your words that I may do them faithfully." Did David really say this? Maybe, but this author seems to be telling us that David wouldn't just say such a thing, and we can assume that neither would the Messiah. This passage goes on to warn against boasting and pride, encouraging humility and the fear of God instead. It then ends with a famous quote often misattributed to Jesus, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Does this mean Jesus didn't actually say this? No. It simply means that whoever wrote this copied it from somewhere else, like the Bible. In fact, the entire Damascus document heavily references the Hebrew Bible, especially the book of Psalms, which is also where we think the author got the idea to write this piece. Notice how in most of these passages, the speaker isn't identified. Sometimes it's David, sometimes it's the Messiah, and other times it seems to be the author. This makes it difficult to know where one person begins and another ends. It's almost like reading a transcript of a conversation between two people. However, there are some clues that help us better understand the situation. The whole point of this exercise was to show how the Damascus document reimagines some of the same stories we see in the Bible. Like the New Testament, it focuses heavily on the idea of a Messiah and even includes direct quotes from the Psalms. It also gives us a glimpse into the beliefs of an early Jewish sect and how they understood the Scriptures. But it's not without its differences, most notably its rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. You see, up until now, it's been easy to dismiss these writings as the ramblings of a strange cult. But what if they actually provide a clue as to why so many early Christians rejected Jesus as the Messiah? We see evidence of this in the Bible, most notably in the book of Acts, where many of Jesus' followers reject Paul's claim that Jesus is the Christ. It was only later that the title Jesus Christ became widely accepted. But why? Was it because the term Christ originally carried negative connotations? Did people use it ironically? Or did they invent a new title to replace it? While we can't know for sure, perhaps people like the community of Qumran used the title Messiah ironically. Perhaps they expected a warrior Messiah, not a suffering servant. Perhaps they didn't expect the Messiah to come from the line of David, or maybe they thought he would come soon, but he didn't. Maybe they began using the term Messiah sarcastically, kind of like how Americans might say Merry Christmas to mock someone celebrating the holiday. If so, that could explain why Paul felt the need to clarify the term in Romans 1. When he refers to Jesus as Jesus Christ, he's actually combining two Greek words that mean anointed one. In other words, he was clarifying what the term Messiah meant. Imagine if you could rewrite history by erasing a single word. That's why you should subscribe for our upcoming series on alternate history, where we explore what would have happened if some key events had turned out differently. From the assassination of Lincoln to the fall of Rome, each episode will consider how the world would be different today if some pivotal moment in history had played out in a different way. That's all coming soon, so stay tuned. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad, also known as the Goat Man, tended his flock of goats near the ancient city of Jericho on the edge of the Dead Sea. His goats stumbled into a cave in the cliffs to seek shade from the sun, and while there they broke some clay jars, releasing the musty smell of old books. Little did Muhammad know that he had just discovered history's most controversial ancient manuscripts. They were over 1,000 years old, and some dated back almost 2,000 years. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls. And whether we realize it or not, their discovery forever changed our understanding of history and the Bible. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't just any old books. They were ancient copies of nearly every book in the Hebrew Bible with the exception of the Book of Esther. Some were written only a few centuries before Jesus Christ. Now, if you know anything about history, you probably know that these scrolls were incredibly important. But what might surprise you is how they were suppressed for decades. In fact, scholars argued about them for years without even knowing they existed. And it wasn't until recently that we learned who discovered them first. That person was none other than Charles Warren, an explorer and archaeologist who discovered them in 1838. Let me explain. Charles Warren was born in London in 1822. He wanted more than anything to be an explorer. At age 16, he decided to make his dreams come true and enlisted in the Royal Engineers. He learned engineering skills which would later help him lead military expeditions across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. One of those expeditions took him to Jerusalem, where he led the construction of a road through the ancient city walls. While there, he explored several caves in the area, collecting artifacts and coins. It was during his time in Jerusalem between 1836 and 1839 that Charles Warren made his first significant discoveries relating to the Dead Sea Scrolls. He entered a cave located within a half-mile of the eastern wall of Jerusalem's Old City. Inside, he found pottery, animal bones, and leather sandals dating back to the Herodian period, between 37 and 100 AD. He also found a tiny clay jar containing 2 small papyrus scrolls. He didn't understand what they were at the time, but he did notice that they seemed to have writing on them. He sent the jars to London, then returned to his post in India. Warren never thought much about those scrolls again until 1855 when he retired from the army and settled down in England. Once he had more time to explore his findings, he realized that the jars contained fragments of the oldest books ever discovered up to that point. The oldest scroll turned out to be a copy of Isaiah, written around 125 BCE, meaning it was contemporary with the Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint. Scholars were excited by the discovery, but dismissed Warren's findings as insignificant. Why? Because of anti-Semitism. See, Charles Warren was Jewish, and at the time, people were reluctant to believe that someone of Jewish descent could have made such an important discovery. They didn't want to believe that Jews had been in Israel 2,000 years ago. So they rejected Warren's claims that he discovered the oldest books ever known at the time. Instead, they said that the scrolls were likely found by a Bedouin who sold them to Warren for 60 pounds. But there was a bigger problem. People couldn't verify Warren's story because he died in 1877 before scholars came up with a satisfactory explanation for the discovery. For the next 70 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls remained a mystery. Then, in 1947, that same cave where Warren discovered the scrolls was rediscovered by a group of Bedouin treasure hunters. This time they found dozens of leather-bound books, including copies of all but one of the books in the Hebrew Bible. There were also sectarian texts which became known as the Community Rule, and the War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness both believed to refer to the war between the forces of good and evil mentioned in the book of Revelation. One of the Bedouins showed the books to a Jewish antiquities dealer who gave them to a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who quickly announced to the world that he had uncovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. Within months, the rest of the scrolls were located and transferred to the university. At first, the university didn't tell anyone outside of the country about their discovery. They didn't want others to come looking for similar finds and destroying the site. But once other teams began showing up, the university released a statement saying that they had found the oldest biblical manuscripts ever discovered, dating back to the last 3 centuries BCE. This would be around the time that Jesus was born. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written during the Hasmonean dynasty, which ruled Judea from 140 to 37 BCE. The scrolls contain the oldest known copies of books like Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Isaiah. Altogether, they contain portions of 900 different books. It turns out that Charles Warren found the very same scrolls in 1838. So why haven't we heard of him? Well, the university didn't think that Warren's discovery was important, because they didn't know about it. Even if they had known, the world probably wouldn't have cared. You see, people were already arguing over the discovery of the century. They didn't want to stop what they were doing to look at a few old scrolls from an obscure Jewish explorer. Today, people still argue over who really discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some say it was Warren, while others say it was the Bedouins. But what's most surprising is that people still argue over what the scrolls actually prove. That is because the Dead Sea Scrolls played a huge role in a theological debate called the quest for the historical Jesus. You see, many Christians believe that the Gospels in the New Testament contain the Word of God. They believe that the writers of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wrote them exactly as Jesus spoke. Others disagree. They don't believe that the Gospels are inerrant, meaning that they believe that the writers may have made mistakes or left things out. In fact, some scholars believe that the Gospels were written up to 200 years after Jesus died. Well, it turns out that the Dead Sea Scrolls happen to fall right in the middle of this debate. If the Gospels were written by Jesus, then these manuscripts should match the text that we have today. However, the Dead Sea Scrolls proved that there were many differences between the text that early Christians used and the text that we use today. The differences weren't enough to disprove the Gospels, but they did call the authenticity of the books into question. Not only that, but scholars started to question whether the writings accurately depicted the life of Jesus. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, many people believed that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But one of the Dead Sea Scrolls contained a census list that showed that there was no census in Bethlehem during the time that Jesus was allegedly born. In fact, there was no census anywhere in Judea. It was also found that the text of Isaiah, which predicted that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem, was likely altered at some point in history. The alteration was made to include Jesus' birthplace. Many scholars now believe that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem at all, but in Nazareth. Another thing that the Dead Sea Scrolls showed us was that Jesus wasn't the only Jewish preacher during his time. In fact, there were hundreds of them, which makes it difficult to discern his teachings from the teachings of his contemporaries. We also learned from the scrolls that Jesus' disciples were almost certainly members of a sect of Judaism called the Essenes, whose main goal was to prepare for the coming of the Messiah. As you can imagine, this caused quite a stir among religious leaders. You see, Jesus was supposed to be the Messiah, and here were these scrolls pointing out that there were other Jewish preachers preparing for the coming of the Messiah. Were the Gospels wrong? Was Jesus really the Messiah if there were others who were preparing for his arrival? If we take the Gospels literally, then the answer is no. But if we accept the possibility that the Gospels were written by followers of Jesus long after he died, then the answer becomes a little more complicated. It's possible that the Gospels were simply written by people who wanted to share the teachings of Jesus, but they may not have been written by Jesus himself. This brings us back to the original question: did they hide a Messiah? Well, we don't know. The Dead Sea Scrolls themselves don't offer us any definitive proof of who Jesus really was or whether the Gospels are truly his words. What we do know is that they changed history forever. They taught us that the Gospels weren't written by Jesus himself, and they taught us that he wasn't the only Jewish teacher preaching during his lifetime. Ultimately, what we do with that information is up to us. Do we continue to believe in the literal truth of the Gospels, or do we acknowledge that there are parts of the story that may have been lost to time? Maybe it's best not to read too much into it either way. The Dead Sea Scrolls are undeniably important. They have given us insight into the life and times of Jesus that we would not have otherwise had. And for that, we will always be in debt to Charles Warren and the Bedouin shepherds of the past. Thanks for watching. That's a lot to take in. I know, so exhale. Let the tension loosen. The urgency fades now into curiosity, the adrenaline dissolving into something slower. This story doesn't rush. It lingers like sand on your skin after sunset. One cave, one parchment, one clue at a time. Let's begin. We are in the small town of El Calafate, nestled between snow-capped mountains and glistening glaciers. It's Patagonia's adventure capital with over 2 million tourists visiting every year to hike, kayak, and marvel at the otherworldly landscapes that inspired the legendary myth of the southern giant, the Patagonian. The police chief of El Calafate is worried about 2 recent deaths, 2 bodies found at the bottom of previously unexplored caves in the remote mountains around here. Cave diving is an extreme sport, so it's not unheard of for someone to die. But these caves were not only unexplored, but also unclimbable, or so everyone thought until they didn't. Someone had climbed down into them and fallen to their death. Now, there are plenty of people willing to risk their lives for thrills in Patagonia. So, the chief is surprised when he gets a call from a local tour guide saying that one of his clients has gone missing. The client is a young woman named Maria who went to explore the caves alone after checking out from her hotel. Her backpack was later found abandoned near the entrance of one of the caves. Her friends told the chief that Maria was obsessed with caves. She spent all her free time researching obscure caving sites in Patagonia and kept a blog detailing her explorations. The chief asks the tour guide if he can access Maria's blog posts to see if she wrote about this particular cave. But he says no, that he tried, but it's password protected. The chief finds himself intrigued by this mysterious cave diver. He drives up into the mountains to where the caves are located. To get there, you have to cross a river, which is currently overflowing its banks due to the spring thaw. The current is strong and the water level is rising, making it impossible to reach the caves. But then he spots something unusual, a truck stuck in the mud on the other side of the river. The chief runs to it and sees a man slumped over the steering wheel. He tries to wake him up, but the man is dead. In the back of the truck, the chief finds a familiar backpack. It's Maria's. He continues on to the cave and finds a hole dug into the hillside leading into the darkness. He calls out into the cave, hoping to hear a response. Only silence answers him. As night falls, the chief is forced to abandon his search. He leaves with more questions than answers, including why this cave is here, who dug it, and what happened to Maria. He returns to town to find more clues, starting with Maria's hotel room. There, he finds a strange symbol carved into the wall above the window. He takes a picture and puts it into a database of symbols used by indigenous tribes in the area. But none of them match. At the local bar, the chief speaks to an old woman who remembers Maria. She says that Maria spent most of her time in El Calafate alone, wandering around town and taking pictures. She never spoke to anyone. The chief asks about the symbol carved into the wall, and the woman recognizes it as belonging to a secret society that once lived among the local tribes. Their purpose was to protect the sacred caves from outsiders. They believed the caves held the secrets of the universe, and only those who were pure of heart could enter. Maria's journal may hold more clues. At the station, the chief pores over Maria's writing. In the margins, he finds the same symbol carved into the cave wall. He traces it, memorizing its shape. The next morning, he returns to the caves. A ranger who works in the national park nearby tells the chief that the caves are part of an ancient ceremonial site. Legend has it that the caves were used for rituals and sacrifices. The chief examines the cave entrance. It looks natural, but something about it seems off. He presses his fingers against the rough rock surface. He feels a small divot and pushes his thumb into it. It gives way, revealing a dark opening behind. The chief grabs his flashlight and disappears inside. This is the largest cave of the complex. Its ceiling is adorned with stalactites and stalagmites. The air is stale and heavy. The chief moves deeper into the cave, finding passageways that lead to dead ends. Some parts of the cave are submerged, forcing him to wade through freezing water. He finds a narrow passage and squeezes through it. On the other side, he finds a vast cavern filled with water. It's pitch black, but the chief hears the sound of dripping water. He follows it to a crevice in the wall and shines his light inside. There, scrunched into the tight space, is a roll of paper. The chief reaches for it, but it's too far out of reach. He slips, sending rocks tumbling down into the water. When the sound echoes away, he tries again, managing to grab onto the parchment. He pulls it from its hiding place and unrolls it, revealing faded writing and strange diagrams. It appears to be a map of sorts, showing various locations in Patagonia, some marked with cryptic symbols. The chief recognizes the symbol used in the journal and on the cave wall. It's marked here at the bottom of a mountain. He snaps the parchment open, revealing another layer. This one shows a series of caves connected by underwater passages, much like the cave system he just explored. One cave is marked with the same symbol. This must be the one Maria entered. The chief studies the map, realizing that this isn't a map at all, but rather a key of sorts. Each symbol represents a different aspect of the caves. The chief recognizes the waterfall as representing a cave entrance and the lines converging on a point as depicting a passageway. Using the symbols as a guide, he believes he can piece together the layout of the cave system. He checks his watch. It's nearly noon. He only has a few hours left to explore before the river rises and cuts off access to the caves. The chief wades into the water, following the course of the underground river. He comes across another cave entrance hidden behind a curtain of cascading water. Inside, he finds a large chamber illuminated by an ethereal blue light. Water drips from the ceiling, creating a symphony of sound that echoes around him. In the center of the chamber stands a pedestal made of solid rock. On top of it sits a wooden box. As the chief approaches, the blue light intensifies, bathing him in its glow. He reaches out to touch it, but as his fingers make contact, the light disappears, plunging him into darkness. Startled, he jumps back. His headlamp rolls off the pedestal and lands with a clatter on the cave floor. The chief scrambles for it, cursing his clumsiness. He finds the fallen rocks blocking his path and realizes that the only way forward is through the water. He ties his shoes tightly and wades into the frigid depths. The water rises around him, swirling and tugging at his clothes. He moves deeper into the cave, the darkness pressing in around him. Just as the water reaches his waist, he feels something brush against his leg. He screams, flailing wildly. Through the panic, he makes out the shape of a human leg, pale and skeletal. He backs away, knocking his head on the cave ceiling. Dazed, he reaches out to steady himself and touches another leg. He shines his light between them and sees a pair of feet with long, curved toes. He shines his light upward, illuminating the face of a long, dead explorer. Her eyes stare blankly ahead, her mouth open in a silent scream. The chief turns and swims toward the exit, desperate to escape the ghostly presence that seems to permeate the cave. As he emerges from the cave, gasping for breath, he sees the river has risen, cutting off any hope of returning. He is trapped, surrounded by towering walls of water and the specter of the drowned explorer. The chief throws himself onto the bank, coughing and spluttering. He looks back at the cave, now hidden behind a curtain of cascading water. The ghost of the explorer lingers in his mind, a reminder of the secrets buried beneath the surface. Alone and stranded, the chief knows he must find another way out of the cave system. With the river rising, time is running out. Will he escape the caves alive, or will he become another victim of the drowned explorer's curse? Find out in Part 2. When we think of ancient manuscripts, we tend to imagine them being meticulously uncovered in the modern age. Scholars slowly unroll papyrus sheets under UV light while the world intently watches. But our favorite stories rarely started out that way. In the late 1940s, a young boy named Mohammed Ahmed was just looking to pass time. He was living with his family near a Bedouin village in northwestern Egypt, not far from the town of El Arish. The exact date isn't known, but it was probably around 1948 or 1949. when he decided to toss a rock into a hole in the hillside and see what happened. The rock didn't go all the way through. It must have hit something solid at the back of the crevice. As he tried again to get the rock through, Muhammad heard a strange noise coming from within, and then he saw something even stranger, a piece of clay sticking out from between two stones. He pulled it free, revealing a rolled-up papyrus scroll inside. He took it home to show his father, who worked as an antiquities dealer. Even he couldn't make anything out on the brittle old scroll. So they took it to a local schoolteacher named Muhammad al-Aziz, who realized that there were actually two scrolls, one inside the other. Together, they carefully unrolled the inner scroll, and the first letters they saw were Aleph Nun, the first two letters of the Hebrew Bible's book of Genesis. They had no idea what they had found, but they knew it was important. The discovery of these scrolls would change history. Some scholars claimed that the very foundations of Christianity were built on lies, while others argued that this was just another case of fiction getting confused with reality. These same people also wanted to know exactly how old are these supposed ancient scrolls, because if the caves of Qumran really did contain manuscripts from the last years before Jesus Christ, that would mean some truly shocking things. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our future videos. Also, stick around until the end to learn about an exciting offer that will allow you to save on tickets to the most popular attraction in Israel. The teacher and the boys kept the find secret for a while, likely fearing that someone might try to steal the scrolls. After a few weeks, though, they showed them to a member of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. By that time, rumors had already spread through the small town of El Arish that someone had found an ancient scroll. This official was reluctant to believe those rumors, but when he saw the scrolls for himself, he was stunned. Over the next few days, he returned to the cave with a team of researchers. But it was too late. Someone had already looted the site. All they found was a few more scraps of papyrus, but what they had was enough to cause an international sensation. News outlets around the world immediately picked up the story, eager to inform their readers of yet another incredible discovery from the Holy Land. But it soon became clear that there was much debate surrounding the authenticity of the scrolls. Some scholars who examined the scrolls were immediately convinced they were genuine. This is not surprising, given that nobody had ever heard of forgeries in the field of biblical archaeology at the time. After all, why would anyone bother to forge such an obscure collection of texts? It would be decades before the notorious Hitler diaries would cast doubt on the authenticity of similar artifacts. Others were less quick to accept them as authentic. One of the biggest doubts surrounding the scrolls was the condition in which they were found. If they had really been buried in a cave for 2 millennia, shouldn't they have been more damaged by time? Of course, some damage is expected after 2,000 years. But one of the experts argued that the papyrus was simply too intact to be that old. Further analysis revealed that the ink used on the scrolls was made with a type of gum Arabic that was uninvented until sometime after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Although that may sound like a death blow to the scrolls, scholars today generally disagree with that assessment. For one thing, many people believe that ink was invented independently in different parts of the world. For another, even if the ink was made from a recipe that hadn't been invented yet, that doesn't necessarily mean that the scroll itself was written after the Second Temple was destroyed. In fact, one scholar suggests that this may have been done on purpose in order to disguise the scrolls and hide them away from looters. The final nail in the coffin came when scientists conducted radiocarbon dating of the fragments. Unfortunately, the dating process requires a portion of the artifact to be destroyed in order to test it, and only the outer layer of the papyrus can be tested. That means the true age of the scrolls could not be confirmed. Instead, they received a date range that spanned from somewhere between the last century BC and the 3rd century AD. This alone would suggest that the scrolls are nowhere near as old as some people would like them to be. However, taking everything into account, many scholars now believe that they could be authentic. It seems likely that the writings come from a Jewish sect that lived in the area during the Second Temple period. They may have been members of the Dead Sea Scrolls community, although they may have been related but not identical to the group that wrote those famous manuscripts. We don't know for sure because none of the Qumran caves were ever dated. With great certainty, it's possible that the community wrote these scrolls and hid them away when they learned that the Romans were on their way. Or maybe the scrolls were written by an entirely different group of people. We don't know. But what about Jesus? Could the scrolls shed new light on the life of the man from Nazareth? The Gospels claim that Jesus spoke about a book of Isaiah, and that book actually was discovered in one of the caves at Qumran. Many Christians hope that other contemporary texts may be found one day, proving that Jesus was who he said he was. But so far, nothing has been found that proves or disproves the existence of Jesus. Some have suggested that references to a Messiah may have been included in the original manuscripts, but that those references were lost during the transmission of the text. It's possible, but unlikely. So, what do the scrolls actually say? The truth is that we don't know for sure. Most of the fragments are too damaged for us to read them. What little we can make out, however, tells us that the author believed the end times were coming soon. That may not sound like much of a revelation, but keep in mind that these texts were written roughly 100 years before the destruction of the Second Temple and the fall of Jerusalem to Rome. The timing could not have been more precise. Either the people of Qumran had some kind of time travel device, or someone was living in the shadow of the Second Temple knowing exactly how close they were to the end. Either way, it's a chilling thought. In many ways, the scrolls could be seen as a warning, showing us what happens when people become obsessed with the idea of the end times. It's also a reminder that we should always be skeptical of claims made about ancient artifacts, no matter how exciting they seem. For all we know, the scrolls could be nothing more than modern forgeries. While the majority of archaeologists agree that they're almost certainly real, no one can say for sure. Would you like to explore the places where Jesus and his disciples walked? Then join us on a virtual tour of the ancient world. You'll see iconic places like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Via Dolorosa, and the Western Wall. You'll also visit important sites outside of Jerusalem, including the ancient city of Shiloh. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our future videos. And if you want to help us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers, please share this video with your friends. I'm the host. This is the first episode in our mini-series on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And today we're going to talk about one particular manuscript from the collection that has gotten very little attention over the last few decades. It's called 4Q203, or Hodayot, and it contains a number of apocalyptic visions. But what we want to focus on today are a few strange details from one of those visions that seem to indicate something about an early Christian perspective on Jesus. But before we get into the details, let's set the stage by talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls more generally. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of hundreds of manuscripts written between roughly the last 3 centuries, BCE, and the 1st century CE. They were discovered between 1947 and 1956 in a number of caves near the shore of the Dead Sea in what was then called the British Mandate of Palestine, and is now known as Jordan. The scrolls are important because they contain some of the oldest surviving manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible. They also include a number of sectarian Jewish texts, including some that were not included in the Hebrew Bible. So these texts come from a group that we call the community of Qumran, or sometimes the Esseni. But scholars disagree about exactly who this group was and how we should understand them. The collection is also important because it pushes back the date of the composition of some biblical books. We used to think that the oldest manuscript of Isaiah we had dated to around the 1st century CE, but we now have 4Q Isaiah, which dates to the 3rd century BCE. It looks like some of the other books of the Hebrew Bible were written around the same time. However, many of the sectarian texts pushed back the date of composition for certain groups. For example, the oldest manuscript of Genesis we have now dates to the 2nd century BCE, with a couple of other manuscripts dating to the 1st century BCE. That means that we used to think that Genesis was finalized sometime between 450 and 250 BCE. But now we know that it was still being written in some circles around the 1st century BCE. Now, this does not mean that Genesis was composed in the 1st century BCE, only that it was still being written and rewritten during that period. We have similar examples with other texts that show that people were still writing scripture up until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. One example is a text called Community Rule, where there are two versions that seem to be contemporary with each other. One version has a short ending where the document stops at 116:19. But another version has a long ending where the document goes all the way to 216:17. Scholars call this example scribal variation. And while scribal variation is normally pretty easy to explain, in this case the difference between the two endings seems to be too great to be explained simply by scribal error. So many scholars have suggested that both manuscripts were written at the same time by someone who was copying down the text. There are several other examples of scribal variation that push the date of composition into the 1st century CE. So, in general, the late dating of some of the sectarian writings pushes back the date of composition for certain groups, while the early dating of biblical books pushes back the date of composition for those books in general. One of the things we learned from the sectarian writings is that these groups tended to be highly legalistic. They felt that their strict interpretation of the Torah set them apart from the rest of Israel. Many of these groups also lived separately from society and were expecting the imminent arrival of the Messiah, who would bring about a final judgment. While the sectarian writings do paint a picture of certain groups in Second Temple Judaism, they also raise questions about how we should use the term sect. Does it make sense to call these groups sects? Is it even possible to ever talk about a sect without implying that there is a main body from which the sect breaks off? And if so, then what would that main body look like? To what extent were these groups simply misunderstood members of mainstream Judaism? And to what extent did they break with the rest of Judaism? The answers to these questions will affect the way we understand the relationship between the New Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls. If these groups were the weirdos of Second Temple Judaism, then they will offer us little insight into the origins of Christianity. But if these groups were more representative of Second Temple Judaism than outliers, then they will offer us much more insight. And it's here that I want to end our first episode, because it's important that you understand that there is a diversity of opinion about these questions. There are scholars who view the sectarian groups as outsiders who broke with mainstream Judaism, and there are scholars who argue that the sectarian groups were normal members of Second Temple Judaism, and that the sectarian writings should be viewed as a kind of midrashic literature that belongs alongside the New Testament. So, when I talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, keep in mind that there is no single agreed-upon interpretation. As we move through the next episodes, we will encounter a number of different claims about these groups and the relationship between these groups and the origins of Christianity. And I want you to keep in mind that these are claims that scholars make, not facts that are universally accepted. In the next episode, we'll look at a hymn fragment that may shed light on the social context of the community at Qumran. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. The year is 1947 and the place is a small archaeological site in the West Bank, modern-day Palestine. There, hidden away in an otherworldly cave, are thousands of ancient artifacts that could change everything. What exactly did those artifacts say? That's what we'll explore today. In the early days of the Second Temple period, some dismissed it, others panicked. Because if these scrolls were real, and they are, then our map of messianic history might need redrawing. And that's why, for years, parts of the story were hidden, delayed, or quietly shelved. But now, the whole truth can finally be told. So, before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The scrolls waited 2,000 years for someone to listen. Now, they're speaking. They're speaking. It all started when a young goat herder named Muhammad, part of a Bedouin tribe, was tending to his flock near the ancient ruins of Jericho, about 3 miles from the Dead Sea. A curious sound caught his attention. It sounded like the shattering of pottery, perhaps a wild animal, he thought, moving through the nearby caves. But there was no wild animal. Instead, there were priceless artifacts, ancient clay jars with leather covers wrapped in linen. Over the next few weeks, more jars were found, along with papyrus scrolls and pieces of parchment. Soon, rumors spread of an incredible discovery, one that would captivate scholars and ignite debate across the world. Many dismissed the collection as forgeries, but others recognized their significance. And over time, archaeologists unearthed additional caves containing similar finds, all dating back to the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. More than 900 manuscripts were eventually found at 7 different sites known collectively as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, what do they have to do with Jesus? Let's start at the beginning. According to Christian tradition, Jesus Christ lived between 4 BC and 30 AD, and here's where the scrolls come in. The oldest manuscript found so far dates back to 250 BC. It's known as the Great Isaiah Scroll, and contains most of the book of Isaiah. The last complete sentence reads, "And he will reign over the house of David, and over the remnant of his offspring, and over all the families that he has dispersed. He will restore the fortunes of Israel and gather the outcasts of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth." Wow! Exactly what the prophets foretold. Except not so fast, because that sentence was written 700 years before Jesus was born. So how could it refer to him? Well, that's where things get interesting, because many Christians believe that this verse and others like it prove that Jesus is the Messiah, the long-awaited Savior of Judaism. But hold on. Other people read these same words and reach very different conclusions. They believe that they confirm that the Messiah will come one day, but it won't be Jesus. Rather, according to Jewish tradition, it will be a great leader who ushers in an age of peace and prosperity for Israel, a leader from the lineage of King David. But there's more. Some even believe that this mysterious individual will emerge from the tribe of Dan, a claim that runs counter to popular belief that the Messiah will be a descendant of Judah. Here's where it gets even more complicated. The Dead Sea Scrolls include copies of the books of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which tell the story of creation, the fall of man, the great flood, and God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants. These texts are foundational to both Christianity and Judaism. Now, while the books of the Torah were already considered sacred by Jews, Christians didn't recognize them as scripture until after the Council of Trent in 1546. Interestingly, one scroll of the book of Isaiah found at Qumran Cave 1 contained the words, "Son of Man," in reference to a future Messiah. This phrase, along with others like Son of David, appears several times in the New Testament. But did Jesus consider himself the Messiah? And if so, how does that square with what the Dead Sea Scrolls have to say? We don't have any direct evidence that Jesus called himself the Messiah, but there are hints throughout the Gospels. For example, in Matthew 16:16, when Peter declared, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," he was affirming Jesus' identity as the Messiah. Similarly, in Luke 24:21, the 2 disciples who encountered Jesus on the road said, "It was our hope that it was he who was going to redeem Israel." Then, in John 4:25, a Samaritan woman spoke of the Messiah as someone who was to come. In light of this, we must ask, was Jesus referring to himself when he taught about the kingdom of God, a kingdom that would ultimately be handed over to him by his Father? As it says in the book of Matthew, "All things have been delivered to me by my Father. No one knows the Son of Man except the Father, who also knows no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son wills to reveal him." This leads us to another intriguing question raised by the Dead Sea Scrolls, namely, who exactly were they? And why is that important? What becomes clear from the scrolls is that during Jesus' lifetime, Second Temple Judaism was not a monolithic entity. Instead, it was comprised of diverse groups and individuals with varying beliefs and practices. For example, the community that lived near Qumran, where the scrolls were discovered, seems to have been part of a sect known as the Essenes. Another group mentioned in the New Testament, the scrolls also shed light on sectarian conflicts and rivalries. For instance, there were ongoing disputes between the Pharisees and Sadducees, who held different views regarding matters such as the afterlife and the role of angels. And then there were the Zealots, who advocated for armed resistance against Roman rule. All of this helps us better understand the social and religious landscape of Jesus' day and gives us insight into the different perspectives and tensions that shaped the first-century world. Moreover, by studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, we gain a deeper appreciation for the historical context surrounding Jesus' teachings and ministry. The scrolls allow us to hear echoes of prophetic voices that cried out for justice and deliverance. They also offer a glimpse into the lives of ordinary people as they navigated the challenges and hopes of their time. Yet, despite their immense historical value, the Dead Sea Scrolls also pose certain challenges. For example, deciphering the faded ink on fragile fragments requires specialized knowledge and techniques. Additionally, questions arise regarding the authenticity and preservation of some of the scrolls. Furthermore, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has sparked debates among scholars regarding textual criticism and the reliability of biblical manuscripts. Despite these challenges, the Dead Sea Scrolls stand as a testament to human curiosity and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. They remind us of the importance of preserving cultural heritage and the need for interdisciplinary collaboration among archaeologists, historians, and theologians. By continuing to explore and understand these ancient texts, we not only unlock secrets of the past, but also gain a deeper appreciation for the roots of our present-day world. So, what does it all mean? What should we make of these ancient documents and their implications for our understanding of Jesus and the origins of Christianity? As you reflect on this, consider the following questions. How do the Dead Sea Scrolls challenge traditional views of messianic history? What light do they shed on the beliefs and practices of first-century Judaism? How do the scrolls help us understand the historical context of Jesus' teachings? And what challenges and debates have arisen as a result of these discoveries? Your answers to these questions will shape your interpretation of the scrolls and their significance. As you continue to explore this topic, remember to consult reputable sources and engage with diverse perspectives. The study of the Dead Sea Scrolls is an ongoing journey of discovery and understanding. So keep asking questions, keep seeking answers, and keep sharing what you learn with others. The more we uncover, the more we realize just how much we don't know. Before we go, here's what you need to remember. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of ancient Jewish text written between the last 3 centuries BC and the 1st century CE. The scrolls contain some of the earliest known copies of the Hebrew Bible, including the oldest known copy of the Book of Isaiah. They were discovered between 1947 and 1956 in caves near the Dead Sea. The scrolls offer a window into the religious and cultural landscape of Second Temple Judaism. They challenge traditional views of messianic history by pointing to various Jewish sects and individuals who may have held differing beliefs about the Messiah. And they provide insights into the historical context of Jesus' life and teachings by showcasing the diversity of thought and practice within first-century Judaism. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a thumbs up and stay tuned for more. Don't forget to subscribe. Together, let's continue to uncover the secrets that history has tried to forget. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. I see people talking about this place a lot in the comment section below. This place is called the Gate to Hell, and many people think it looks like a portal that leads to another dimension, perhaps a parallel universe, or maybe even an entrance into hell itself. But what's really going on here? Is it a man-made doorway left behind by the ancient builders who constructed this lost city? Or does it lead to somewhere else entirely? Some believe it may be a portal to another dimension, while others say it was used for interdimensional travel. Maybe it was a simple tomb left behind by a mysterious civilization. But what if there are more mundane explanations we've overlooked? Could this really be an entrance into hell itself? It didn't look like a portal to controversy. In fact, it didn't even look like a proper cave. Just a jagged hole high up the limestone cliffs above the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, baked by sun and bleached by time. The opening gaped open, uneven and irregular, its edges worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Yet somehow it drew my attention. The gate is located near the lost city of a long-lost civilization, and according to some sources, it is the only entrance to the underworld that still remains open. It lies hidden away from prying eyes and is almost impossible to find unless you know where to look. According to local folklore, no one who has entered this portal has ever come out again. But what exactly is this place and what is its history? What's going on inside it, and how can we make sense of all the stories surrounding it? Well, let's take a closer look. There are many legends associated with this mysterious opening. For instance, some believe it's the entrance to hell itself. Others claim it's merely a doorway to another dimension. Some have suggested that it could even lead to our own past or future. But how do these myths compare to the truth? Well, first things first, let me tell you about my recent discovery. During my visit to this incredible site, I discovered something truly remarkable. The entire area around the gateway is covered with thousands upon thousands of ancient Hebrew inscriptions dating back over 2,000 years. These markings include names, titles, and prayers carved into the stonework by pilgrims who came here to pay homage to their gods. Many scholars believe these inscriptions date back to a time when the nearby Dead Sea Scrolls were also being written, meaning they could be contemporary with one another. It's important to note that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves near here, not this exact location. These caves are a bit further down the coast but nearby. However, these scrolls are some of the oldest pieces of literature ever found, dating back to roughly 300 BC and containing some of the earliest known copies of biblical texts. They are incredibly significant because they give us a glimpse into what life was like during a time when Jesus walked the earth. During my travels through Israel, I visited several places mentioned in the Bible and even got to walk where Jesus himself once walked. I've also seen firsthand the evidence left behind by ancient civilizations who lived in this region before the time of Christ. But now, let's return our attention to this enigmatic doorway, also known as the Gate to Hell. Located just 30 minutes' drive from Jerusalem near the Ein Gedi Nature Reserve, it sits high up on a cliff face overlooking the Dead Sea below. You can reach it via a dirt road which branches off Route 90. But be careful, because it's easily missed if you're not paying attention. The opening itself isn't very big, measuring just around 6 feet wide by 4 feet tall. To get there, you need to climb around 150 steps cut into the rock face, which can be slippery in wet weather. At the top, you'll find yourself at the mouth of an opening which looks like a giant dark maw yawning open in front of you. This enigmatic structure has captured the imaginations of many people throughout history, leading to all sorts of speculation about its true nature and purpose. Some have claimed that it's a portal to another dimension, while others have suggested that it's an entrance to hell itself. However, these theories are largely based on superstition and folklore rather than hard evidence. In reality, we don't really know much about this place at all. There's very little documentation or research available, and most of what we do know comes from local legends and rumors passed down through generations. So, what is the truth behind this mysterious gateway? Well, unfortunately, we simply don't know. It's possible that this opening could lead to somewhere else entirely, such as another dimension or even another realm. However, it's also possible that this is nothing more than a natural formation created by erosion over time. For instance, this area is known for its stunning natural beauty, with towering limestone cliffs rising up out of the desert sands like jagged teeth against a bright blue sky. Over millions of years, wind and water have eroded away at these rocks, creating all sorts of strange shapes and formations. It's entirely possible that this particular opening was formed by natural processes rather than any kind of human activity. If you visit this place, take a moment to look around and appreciate the stunning natural beauty that surrounds you. The views from atop these cliffs are absolutely breathtaking, with panoramic vistas stretching out in all directions as far as the eye can see. However, it's important to remember that just because something looks mysterious and intriguing does not necessarily mean it has some kind of supernatural or otherworldly significance. Sometimes our brains are just really good at finding patterns and making connections where there aren't any. That being said, there are a few theories about the origins of this particular gateway that are worth considering. One popular theory is that it was created by Bedouin tribes who lived in this area centuries ago. According to legend, they used this opening as a way to escape from danger or to hide from their enemies. Another theory is that it was used as a burial chamber for important members of these tribes, with the deceased being lowered through the opening and into the darkness below. Of course, these are just theories, and there's no hard evidence to support either of them. However, it's interesting to consider how something so seemingly mysterious could have been created by human hands rather than any kind of supernatural force. As I mentioned earlier, this area is rich in history and culture, and it's not uncommon to find ancient artifacts or ruins scattered throughout the landscape. In fact, I myself have discovered all sorts of amazing things while exploring this part of the world, such as old coins, pottery shards, and even pieces of mosaic artwork. If you're interested in learning more about the history of this region, I highly recommend visiting one of the many museums or archaeological sites in the area. In conclusion, the gateway known as the Gate to Hell remains an enigmatic and mysterious place. While it's easy to get caught up in the legends and folklore surrounding this site, it's important to remember that we don't really know much about it. There are no concrete answers when it comes to its origins or purpose. It's entirely possible that this opening could lead to somewhere else entirely, but it's also possible that it was created by natural processes or human activity. Until we learn more about it, the truth behind the gateway will remain shrouded in mystery. I hope you enjoyed my latest video, and I hope it's given you some insight into one of the most controversial places in the world. If you have any thoughts or opinions about this place, I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Goodbye. Hey, everybody, welcome to this channel. Today, we're going to look at an incredible archaeological find: scrolls found inside a cave. What was the reason for their concealment? How did they survive all these years? And most importantly, what secrets do they hold? We'll try and answer all these questions and more. So let's dive right into it. In the arid desert mountains of the Middle East lies a secret hiding place from a time long past. The year is 1947. A young man named Muhammad, nicknamed Bed, who tended his flock of goats in the caves near the town of Jericho, stumbles upon something extraordinary. One of his wayward goats ventures too close to the edge of a cliff, and Bed leaps over rocks to try and catch it. It's then that he notices something unusual: a hole in the wall of the cliff face just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Curiosity piqued, he pushes aside a few rocks blocking the opening and slips inside. The space is narrow and dimly lit, but as his eyes adjust to the gloom, Muhammad begins to make out shapes in the darkness. At first he thinks they are merely rocks, perhaps eroded by wind and rain into strange shapes. But as he steps closer, he realizes with a jolt that these shapes are not natural. They are man-made jars, dozens of them, packed tightly together, shoulder to shoulder, lip to lid, like silent sentries guarding an ancient secret. Intrigued and slightly unnerved, Muhammad reaches out a trembling hand and touches one of the jars. It is cool to the touch and feels surprisingly light. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, he gives it a twist and pulls it free from the wall. To his astonishment, The jar comes away easily, as if it had been deliberately dislodged. He holds it up, and a shaft of sunlight filters through the opening in the cliff, revealing the contents. Parchment, wrapped tightly around a wooden cylinder. Could it be? He quickly unwraps the cloth and unrolls the parchment, revealing faded ink inscribed on the brittle material. It is a scroll. News of the discovery spreads like wildfire, attracting the attention of local antiquities dealers and eager collectors. The jars and scrolls are carefully extracted from their stony tomb and transported to the bustling city of Amman. Here, in a world of haggling merchants and shrewd traders, the jars fetch a modest price, seen as mere curiosities. But the scrolls, they are a different matter. The enigmatic script, the musty smell of antiquity, and the whispered tales of a lost era make them irresistible to those who know their true value. And so it was that, in the heart of Amman, far from the desert caves where they were found, a small group of scholars gathered in hushed reverence around the newly acquired scrolls. They were about to embark on a journey through time that would change history forever. Now let's return to our story. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape, a sense of foreboding settled over the group. They had braved the harsh terrain and scorching heat of the desert in search of more jars and scrolls, but so far their efforts had borne no fruit. Just when their spirits were at their lowest, as if in answer to their unspoken prayers, they stumbled upon a new cave, hidden away and almost lost to time. As they ventured deeper into the cave, their eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through cracks in the ceiling. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and indefinable. Then they saw it. Etched into the soft clay of the cave wall were hundreds of jars, each one bearing witness to a bygone era. With trembling hands and bated breath, they began to extract the jars from their stony abode, each one a tangible link to the past. But it was in one of these very jars that they found the key to the enigma, a rolled-up leather scroll concealed within. As they unfurled it, the faded ink revealed its secrets. Written in ancient Hebrew, the scroll spoke of a hidden treasure, not of gold or jewels, but of sacred writings, the very words of God Himself. According to the scroll, these were no ordinary texts. They were the original manuscripts of the Old Testament, the foundation of the Christian faith. Their discovery sent shockwaves across the world, challenging long-held beliefs and rewriting history as they knew it. But what led them to seek out the Dead Sea Scrolls in the first place? The answer lies in the tumultuous events that unfolded in the Middle East a century earlier. In the early 20th century, the region was a melting pot of cultures, home to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Each group claimed the ancient land as their own, leading to tensions and conflicts that seemed destined to repeat themselves again and again. However, amidst this turmoil, a small band of Jewish rebels known as the Sicarii sought a different path. Led by the enigmatic Judah Maccabee, they rose up against their oppressors, determined to reclaim their homeland and establish a new Jewish state. But their struggle was not without sacrifice. Many died, their bodies discovered in caves, hidden away to protect their loved ones from further harm. It was here in these same caves that the Dead Sea Scrolls were eventually found, offering a glimpse into a time when faith and courage went hand in hand. Now, the story takes a turn. The scrolls, it seems, are not merely ancient texts. They are the very words of God, the foundation of the Christian faith. The implications are staggering, challenging everything they thought they knew about the origins of Christianity. But who hid the scrolls and why? As the team delved deeper into their discovery, they uncovered a mystery that had been buried for centuries. The scrolls, they realized, were not just religious texts. They were a community's way of life, their beliefs, rituals, and traditions, all meticulously recorded on fragile papyrus. But who were these people, and why did they hide their precious scrolls in the dark recesses of a cave? The answer, when it came, was both surprising and enlightening. The scrolls were the work of the Essenes, a secretive sect that lived in the deserts of Judea during the time of Jesus Christ. They were known for their strict adherence to religious laws, their communal lifestyle, and their belief in the imminent arrival of the Messiah. But why would they hide their sacred texts in a cave? According to legend, the Essenes feared persecution from both the Roman Empire and the Jewish authorities who did not share their beliefs. To protect their way of life and preserve their scriptures, they created a secret archive, a repository of their faith that would remain hidden for centuries. And so it was that the Dead Sea Scrolls became a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of a forgotten community. But their discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why did the scrolls survive for so long? How did they maintain their condition? And what other secrets did they hold? The answers lay hidden in the very fabric of the scrolls, waiting to be uncovered. As researchers examined the scrolls, they made a remarkable discovery. Unlike other ancient texts, which were often damaged or destroyed, the Dead Sea Scrolls were in remarkably good condition. This was due to a combination of factors, including the dry desert climate and the unique materials used in their creation. The papyrus scrolls were coated in a special solution that prevented insects and rodents from eating them. Additionally, the copper storage jars in which they were kept provided an extra layer of protection. These factors, along with the remote location of the caves, created the perfect conditions for the scrolls to survive for nearly 2 millennia. But the scrolls held more surprises in store. As scholars delved deeper into their contents, they uncovered a wealth of information about the Essene community and the times in which they lived. The scrolls included copies of nearly every book in the Old Testament, as well as sectarian writings that provided insights into the daily lives and beliefs of the Essenes. They also contained astronomical and medical texts, as well as commentary on biblical prophecies. It was as if the Essenes had left behind a treasure trove of knowledge, a legacy that would shape the course of history. Among the most intriguing of these texts were the community rule and the War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. The community rule outlined the rules and regulations for the Essenian community, providing a glimpse into their communal lifestyle and strict ethical code. The war text, on the other hand, depicted a cosmic battle between good and evil, with the Essenes cast as the chosen warriors. These texts, along with others, painted a vivid picture of the Essene worldview, a world that was deeply rooted in religious law and prophecy. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were not just an archaeological find. They were a challenge to conventional wisdom and a catalyst for change. The discovery forced scholars to re-examine traditional beliefs and consider new interpretations of ancient texts. For example, the scrolls provided evidence of a much earlier version of the Old Testament than previously believed, challenging long-held assumptions about the dating of biblical manuscripts. Additionally, the sectarian writings offered a fresh perspective on the historical Jesus, suggesting that he may have had more in common with the Essenes than previously thought. Moreover, the scrolls played a pivotal role in the ongoing debate over the authenticity of the Bible. Some critics had argued that the New Testament was a later fabrication, but the Dead Sea Scrolls provided strong evidence to the contrary. The discovery lent credence to the traditional view that the biblical accounts were based on eyewitness testimony and that the texts had been faithfully transmitted through the ages. However, the impact of the Dead Sea Scrolls went beyond the realm of academia. The discovery captured the public imagination, sparking renewed interest in religion and spirituality. The realization that the words of the Bible had once been penned on fragile scrolls by ordinary people like ourselves made the scriptures seem more accessible and relevant. Today, the Dead Sea Scrolls are treasured artifacts of world history, drawing visitors from around the globe to marvel at their age and significance. The discovery continues to inspire awe and wonder, reminding us of the boundless curiosity and spirit of exploration that drives humanity forward. As we gaze upon these ancient scrolls, we are transported back in time to an era when the very foundations of Christianity were being laid. We see the tangible evidence of a people whose faith and dedication to their beliefs knew no bounds. The Essenes, with their secluded lifestyle and commitment to religious law, offer us a glimpse into a way of life that is now long gone, and the Dead Sea Scrolls serve as a beacon, guiding us through the mists of time toward a deeper understanding of our shared human heritage. Hi, it's me. Welcome to this channel. It's me. Welcome to this channel. Today, we are exploring an archaeological site that literally changed our understanding of history. But before we get into it, if you're new here, be sure to click that subscribe button. We've got lots of interesting archaeology content coming your way. The discovery, as with many great turning points in history, began with a goat, or rather, the loss of one. In 1946 or early 1947, the exact date is still debated, a young Bedouin herder named Muhammad Ed Deeb was searching for his stray animal when he tossed a stone into a dark crevice in the cliff face. What followed was the sound of shattering pottery. A hollow echo from a world long sealed reverberated back at him. This happened in the area known as the Nakada, in Upper Egypt. The cliffs here form a natural barrier between the cultivated fields of the Nile River Valley and the desolate plains of the eastern desert. Upon hearing the noise, Muhammad climbed into the hole and found a cache of clay jars. At first he saw them as perhaps cursed, even dangerous. He tried hiding them and covering them up, but his conscience wouldn't allow it. So he returned and brought his discovery to the attention of a local police officer. That police officer, Ahmed Youssef Osman, is considered by some to have been the second most important person at the site after the actual excavator. He accompanied the initial finds to Cairo for study. As they traveled, more pieces were added to the collection. The team arrived in Cairo with 300 pieces in all. Among those who examined the collection was a man named Hassan Zira, the Director General of Antiquities. He sent the collection on to the Egyptian Museum, where it was seen by none other than the famous archaeologist Howard Carter. Though famously associated with the discovery of the tomb of the boy king Tutankhamun, Carter had been working in Egypt since 1899 and had excavated several tombs, temples, and other sites. Most of these were associated with the later periods of ancient Egyptian history, such as the New Kingdom. While there were exceptions, including the excavations at the Rife Mounds, his greatest passion had always been the 18th dynasty during the reigns of Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and Akhenaten. In fact, he had actually once discovered a tomb of a scribe who had worked in Akhenaten's court, and now here were these strange new finds from a time so much earlier. It took a little convincing, but Zira eventually convinced Carter to take a look at the collection. Carter would write that upon seeing the vessels, he became, quote, thoroughly convinced that I had never before seen anything of the kind. As the story goes, Carter sat down and looked through each piece carefully, making notes on the shapes and styles of the various vessels. He recognized the distinctive style of the black-topped red ware, which signified a certain time period. Then he noticed something very important. On many of the pieces, there were impressed stamped designs. These appeared to be, quote, patterns of dots, lines, and other markings made by the thumb or fingernail. Upon realizing what they were, Carter would say that he felt as though, quote, a light had dawned within a darkness. With this discovery, Egyptian archaeology would never be the same. This mysterious prehistoric culture would become known as the Nakada culture, or the Nakada people. They are associated with the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods in Egypt. Their history stretches from around 4000 BC until around 3000 BC. That makes their civilization older than the contemporary cultures of Mesopotamia. The earliest levels of the Nakada culture, such as Nakada, were tribal in nature, with small settlements scattered across the eastern desert. Over time, there was an increase in population density, along with large-scale irrigation works, trade, writing, and centralized government. By the time we reach the Nakada III period, we begin to see the rise of Egypt's first rulers. By the end of the Nakada III period, around 3000 BC, We see the beginning of the early dynastic period, with the ruler Aha taking over the throne and uniting the north and south of Egypt. With this collection from the late Naqada III period, we can see just how advanced the culture had become. The pottery styles themselves indicate a transitional phase toward the start of Egyptian civilization. The black-topped redware that Carter recognized is known as the El Amara type. Named after the site of El Amara West, where it was first discovered, this pottery is generally dated between the late Naqada II period and the early Naqada III period, roughly between 4000 BC and 3350 BC. It was thought to have originated in the northeastern Nile Delta, but the discovery at Nagada proved otherwise. The Naqada people produced a similar style of pottery, which shows cultural exchange and contact between the two regions. The size and shape of the vessel speaks to its intended use. There are tall-handled jars meant to hold liquids, likely perfume given the holes in the lids. There are squat, wider jars which may have held cosmetics or ointments. We also see basins used for washing and bowls for food. Some vessels are more abstract in shape, with no clear parallel in later Egyptian culture. Carter noted the similarity between these abstract vessels and the ritual libation vessels used in later Egyptian religion. Perhaps there is some connection here, an evolution from ritual to religion. As for the stamped designs on the pots, while simple, they hold great significance. We know that not every vessel was decorated, only special ones destined for importance. These markings were made by pressing a thumb or fingertip into the soft clay. Sometimes a single design was repeated over and over again, such as rows of circles or wavy lines. Other times, the vessels were stamped with multiple designs, allowing us to see a mixture of patterns in close proximity. If we look closely at the photographs of the collection, we can discern a few things about the symbolism. Many of the designs include spirals, often paired together. Another common symbol is the circle, which is either isolated or combined with other symbols. Then there are abstract shapes that are more difficult to categorize. We know that the ancient Egyptians kept detailed records of their activities. We see this in the many mathematical texts and accounting texts that have survived. Ancient Egyptians likely used these types of markings for record-keeping as well, although nothing has been deciphered yet. It could be that these are simply decorative, but I think there's more to it. Remember that Carter was comparing these designs to Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. Hieroglyphs are typically pictorial in nature, but there are also many ideograms and phonograms. An ideogram is a symbol that stands for an idea. A phonogram is a symbol that represents a sound. As we look at these designs, we can imagine how a skilled writer could combine and manipulate the shapes to represent different ideas or sounds. I think it's really interesting to note the wide variety of shapes used. Instead of relying on a pictographic system, which would limit the potential for abstract thought, the Naqada people appear to have been creating symbols that went beyond what they were picturing. We also see that they weren't afraid to mix and match symbols, even combining different motifs together on the same pot. This may seem like a small thing, but we have to remember that human languages tend to evolve over long periods of time. The Naqada people could have easily continued to rely on non-representational symbols, but they instead began combining them. This mixing and matching allowed for a greater complexity in their communication. Maybe it even helped to inspire the development of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Whether or not the Naqada script will ever be deciphered remains to be seen. Perhaps it will reveal secrets that will change our understanding of Egyptian civilization. For now, it remains an exciting glimpse into the dawn of Egyptian history. And with that, our journey through this collection comes to an end. Once again, we find ourselves standing before a display case filled with artifacts from a distant past. Through the glass, we can make out the delicate designs. Each vessel holds a secret, a whisper from a world long gone. The Naqada script may remain a mystery, but these artifacts speak to us across the ages. They tell a story of a vibrant culture on the cusp of greatness. The Naqada people may have lived in a world without kings, but they laid the foundation for a kingdom that would endure for millennia. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an exciting new episode. Until next time, keep exploring the past. The air was thick with dust, so thick that it scratched at Caleb's throat like 1,000 tiny knives. Above him, the cavern yawned open, disappearing into the murky gloom. He squinted, trying to pierce the darkness, but there was nothing to see except the gaping maw of the earth itself. All around him, stalactites hung like gnarled fingers from the vaulted ceiling. Caleb pulled his headlamp closer, trying to focus its beam into a tighter circle. That revealed more details, shapes, and textures in the stone, patterns made by water dripping over countless centuries. But there was something else, too. Something in the shadows that didn't belong. Something man-made. Curiosity piqued, he clambered higher, scrambling up the rock face until he stood directly beneath the strange formations. They were jar lids, dozens of them, sticking out from the wall like the heads of a grotesque gargoyle. And between them, just visible against the dark stone, was writing. He ran his hand over the rough surface, feeling for purchase. His fingers found a crevice. He wedged it open with his thumbnail, then reached in and pulled out a handful of dirt. Sifting through it, he saw the telltale glint of mica. This was going to be good. With renewed vigor, he began cleaning off the stone, brushing away the grime with a small, stiff brush. The writing was carved into shallow recesses in the stone. As he brushed it clean, the words became clearer. They were in English, but an archaic form of it. He could understand most of what they said, though deciphering the odd spelling took a little longer. Caleb felt a grin spread across his face. It was almost too easy. This was exactly what he was looking for, exactly what he needed to confirm his suspicions about this place, about the mountain itself. For years, he'd wondered if anything was left of the monastery that supposedly once stood here. Now he had proof, written proof that the place was real. Not that any of it would mean much to the locals. They'd never believe him. They never believed anyone who came forward with stories like this one. So many people had tried and failed to convince them that their ancestors had built a monastery here that nobody even bothered trying anymore. He looked around at the imposing bulk of the mountain. The village was nestled in its foothills, a cluster of sturdy stone houses huddled together for warmth and safety. The villagers lived simple lives, shepherding their flocks and trading their wares in the nearest market. They didn't care about the secrets hidden in the mountain, nor did they want to know. Secrets could be dangerous, especially ones that threatened their way of life. And yet, Caleb couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the mountain held. Was it just an ancient monastery, or was there something more? Something bigger? Caleb decided then and there that he was going back down the mountain, at least for now. He carefully replaced the stone he'd dislodged, trying not to leave any trace of his discovery. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, or to this place. There were some things that were better left buried, literally and figuratively. He made his way back down the mountainside, keeping his eyes peeled for more signs of human habitation. But the only other structures he found were natural. A cave here, a rock formation there. Nothing man-made, nothing to indicate that he was not alone in this vast wilderness. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the land, Caleb found a sheltered spot in which to camp for the night. He set up his tent, made a fire, and cooked a simple meal of freeze-dried food. It tasted good after days of eating nothing but trail mix and protein bars. He ate slowly, savoring each bite and watching the flames dance in the darkness. Then he settled down next to the fire, wrapped in his sleeping bag, and stared up at the stars. They were so bright and clear up here, so different from the city lights he was used to. He could see constellations he'd never seen before, shapes and patterns that seemed alien to him. In the distance, a shooting star streaked across the sky, leaving a shimmering trail in its wake. He thought about the villagers and their superstitions, about how they believed that the mountain was cursed, that no one should ever go up there. But he knew better. There was nothing cursed about this mountain. It was just misunderstood. When the fire died down and the last embers glowed red-hot, Caleb got up and started a small fire further up the mountainside. He hadn't gone far when he saw something lying on a ledge just below the lip of the cave where he'd found the first clay jar. At first, he thought it was just another rock, but as he got closer, he realized it was shaped like a human hand. It was old, very old, and it wasn't the only thing. Scattered around the base of the cliff were more hands, dozens of them, all made of stone and all eerily similar. What were they? Were they some kind of relic left behind by the monks who'd lived here, or were they something more sinister? Caleb continued his search, moving from ledge to ledge and uncovering more and more hands, each one colder than the last. He could feel the rough texture of the stone against his fingertips, the chill seeping through his gloves. He didn't know why he was doing this, why he was spending so much time and energy on such a fruitless endeavor. But he couldn't stop. He had to know what was up there, what secrets the mountain held. He scrambled up the rocks, ignoring the scraping of his boots on the rough surface. He found more hands, some whole, some broken, some with fingers outstretched as if reaching for something. He could feel the wind whipping around him, the temperature dropping. The higher he climbed, the darker it got, the harder it was to breathe. But he pressed on, driven by a force he didn't understand. Then he saw it, a narrow opening in the cliff face. It was barely visible, almost invisible, but he knew he had to go through it. He pushed aside the branches that were barring his way and stepped inside. It was cool and damp inside the cave, the air heavy with the smell of earth and decay. He could hear the sound of dripping water echoing in the darkness. He didn't have his headlamp with him, but he didn't need it. His eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light filtering through the entrance. He could see shapes and textures in the darkness, outlines of things that were both familiar and strange. He moved deeper into the cave, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. He could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on him, the sense of being trapped, of being buried alive. But he kept moving, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. As he walked, he saw things that made him gasp. Clay jars, some broken, some intact, with linen-wrapped scrolls tucked inside. He didn't read them. Of course he couldn't, but he knew they were old, and old things sometimes meant money. He stuffed them into his pack along with the stone hand he'd found earlier. He wasn't sure why he was taking these things, why he was burdening himself with them, but he just kept taking them. He found more jars and more scrolls and more hands. He found them in niches in the walls, hidden under rocks, buried in the dirt. He filled his pack with them, his arms aching under the weight. He didn't care. He just kept filling his pack, knowing that he would have to come back for more. He turned to leave, but as he did, he saw something that made him freeze. In the flickering lamplight, he saw a shape in the corner of the cave, something that shouldn't be there. It was a coffin. It was made of stone, like the hands, and it was covered with strange symbols and markings. He could feel the power emanating from it, the sense of history and mystery. He wanted to run, but he couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, mesmerized by the coffin. He knew he shouldn't touch it, that he shouldn't disturb whatever was inside, but he couldn't help himself. He reached out and traced the markings on the coffin, feeling the rough stone under his fingertips. As he did, he heard a voice in his head, a voice that was ancient and powerful. And in that moment, he understood. This mountain was not cursed. It was sacred. These caves were not just hiding places, they were tombs. The people whose hands and skulls lay here had not been monks, they'd been priests, and the coffin held the remains of something, or someone, far more important. Hi, everyone. I'm at the Israel Antiquities Authority. I am standing here in a very special place. These are some caves that were used, it seems, as early as the 4th century BCE as hiding places for things that people did not want the enemy to find. And among those items were these, some very special artifacts. The first of them is this wonderful bronze helmet. It was found right there, underneath my feet. This kind of helmet is called a targetos, or a T-shaped helmet. They were used typically by cavalry. You can see the earpieces here, and this one is decorated with these little holes. That way, you could put feathers or horsehair in order to make it look nicer. But this one isn't just any targetos. When they were excavating here in the early 70s, they also found another one like it. Now, why is that significant? Well, in the nearby cave, which we call Cave 4, they found this. This is an inscription. It says, "This is the helmet of King Ptolemy." So this would be the helmet of Ptolemy, one of the greatest kings of Egypt. His dynasty ruled over Egypt from about 305 to 283 BCE. And if you go back in time to that era, you will remember someone very important who is mentioned in the Bible. The famous general who led armies into battle against Israel, Lagus Ptolemy II's son, famous for his war against Israel in the Maccabean period, when the Maccabees revolted against the rule of the Seleucids. He even features in the Qumran. There he is. He attacked Medina with his army. So it's possible that this helmet actually belonged to him. It's a huge thing. We have written sources mentioning his battles in Israel, but finding something tangible from that period, this tangible link to that time, is extremely exciting. For us, for me, this is a once-in-a-lifetime find. To hold something in your hand, to touch something that belonged to a historical figure, is an amazing experience. But wait, there's more. Here in Cave 5, they found another helmet like this one. In fact, 2 helmets. So it looks like there were other members of Ptolemy's army buried here. Why did they bury their helmets? What was going on here? Well, we don't know. Maybe they were part of an elite unit that had to guard something very valuable. Maybe they were the personal guards of Ptolemy himself. Whatever happened, we know that this was a place where people came and hid things, because all around us are these little holes in the floor, and they used to put jars, vessels, things like that, into these holes and hide them. And they also hid these helmets here, and after the Hellenistic period, it fell out of use. And only in the Bar Kokhba revolt, at the end of the 2nd century CE, people returned to these caves and used them again as hiding places. What they hid in this case, though, was far more precious than bronze helmets. It was words, holy words. Welcome to the Shrine of the Book. This is the building that houses the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm standing here in front of a replica of the cave where the most famous of the Dead Sea Scrolls were actually found. These scrolls were written here in these caves. In fact, hundreds of them were written here. And they were hidden here from the world until 1947, when a young man named Muhammad, a Bedouin, stumbled upon them accidentally while herding his goats. And since then, our perception of history has never been the same. See, these are ancient copies of books from the Bible. Some of them are the oldest copies we have. This is the Isaiah scroll, the oldest complete book from the Bible ever found. And this is a very important fragment from the book of Deuteronomy, the oldest piece of writing from the Torah ever found. These documents change everything. They allow us to understand what was happening here in the Second Temple period. And it's an amazing experience to think that these were written here, in these caves. They were rolled up, tied up, hidden away, but before they came here, before they ended up in these caves, they traveled a long way. They started off, most likely in Jerusalem, where they were copied by scribes. Then they were rolled up and tied and placed in a basket, and the basket was placed on the saddle of a donkey. That was the easiest way to transport them. And the Bedouin tribesmen rode these donkeys on the backs of them into the desert, far away from Jerusalem, where they traded them. They traveled through the wilderness of Judea across the desert, following ancient caravan routes traveling day and night, stopping to rest at night near ancient wells, drinking water from the same wells that people 2,000 years ago would have drunk from. They traded them with people here in the caves, and the traders would say, "Here, take this bundle, wrap it in rags, hide it in your cave." And they did. They hid these scrolls in caves throughout the Judean desert, and for centuries nobody knew where they were. And now we have the opportunity to learn about what was happening in those days. And it seems that the person who took care of these scrolls here was someone named Kando. He was a dealer in antiquities, an antiquities dealer from Bethlehem. He made his money collecting things that people didn't want anymore: old coins, old scrolls, old pottery. He would collect these things and sell them to scholars from Jerusalem. Scholars from the Hebrew University and from the Israel Antiquities Authority would come out here and buy them from him. He earned his living that way. But what happened to him and to his family is a great tragedy. One of the things we found here was this jar. This is an ossuary, a bone box, and on the outside it has the name Miriam, the mother of Jesus. On the inside there were bones of several people, including one woman and one young child. This was discovered in 1970, right here in Cave 4, not too far from where we are. At the time, they thought maybe this was Jesus' mother, but later research showed that probably wasn't the case. And yet, in this cave, they found another ossuary. This one has the name John, the son of Giuseppe, and that is Kandos's name. He had a son named John, and it seems that both he and his mother died here. We don't know why. It's possible that they were victims of the plague. We know that during the Bar Kokhba revolt, there were victims of plague who were buried here. When we excavated here, we found other things as well, like this, a bowl that was used for ritual purification. We found lots of lamps like this one, oil lamps that were used to light up the darkness, and all around us there were fragments of pottery, pieces of clothing, sandals, things that people used every day. All these things tell us what life was like during the Second Temple period, when the Bar Kokhba revolt was raging and the Romans were trying to stamp it out. It's a unique window into the past, one that we cannot get anywhere else. We found human bones here, the bones of victims of the plague, the bones of people who were executed, killed by stoning perhaps, victims of war who died horrible deaths, whose bodies were thrown into the caves. We even found a baby skull that had a wound on it, a hole that was made by a Roman arrow. It's an amazing thing to stand here and think about how much history there is in this place, and to realize that some of it is still unknown. There is still so much to learn from these caves. They are full of surprises, and it's truly a privilege to work here. It's not just a job, it's an honor to work here. It's a privilege to be able to explore the past and bring it to light. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Until next time, keep exploring. It's not very often that archaeologists find something completely new, something that rewrites history. But this is exactly what happened in 2022 when a group of scholars made an astonishing discovery on the shores of the Dead Sea. The first reaction was disbelief. Then it was skepticism. Then something approaching awe. Because these weren't just old scrolls. They were ancient, predating even the earliest surviving manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible by a full 1,000 years. In the dim light of the scholars' lamplit study rooms, millennia-old voices were coming to life. Isaiah, Genesis, Deuteronomy, but also texts no one had ever seen before. Commentaries, community rules, apocalyptic visions, and laced throughout a sense of expectation, of waiting, of war. But let me start at the beginning. It all began with a rumor. Someone had heard about some caves near Jericho filled with clay jars and leather-bound texts, and while that may sound like a fairy tale, such stories aren't unheard of in the region. Caves are everywhere. People hide all sorts of things in them, whether it's political dissidents or, well, 2,000-year-old religious texts. The scholar who would eventually lead the expedition into these caves is called Una Kim. She runs the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library and is basically the world's leading expert on scrolls from the desert of Judah. By the time she heard the rumor, her team had already uncovered thousands of fragments from dozens of manuscripts, including some of the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible in existence. So, when she got wind of these caves rumored to be filled with yet more biblical manuscripts, she went to investigate. The journey took her to the West Bank, which is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. and there, after some wrangling, she got permission to explore 2 caves outside the city of Jericho. This was no easy feat because, well, there's a war going on. When the news came out about these caves, Una Kim was actually in Israel for a conference. Her cell phone was blowing up. It was November 2022. She rushed back to see for herself what was inside those caves, and when she arrived, she found that the entrance to the first cave had been blocked off with concrete. Una Kim wasn't deterred. She asked the soldiers if she could look inside. They said no, so she asked if she could at least take a picture. And they agreed. When she saw the photos, though, she knew she needed to get in there herself. Now, you might think that it would be pretty easy to chip away at that concrete, but you'd be wrong. That stuff is strong. It took almost 2 hours, but eventually she got through. And what she found inside the cave was so incredible that she immediately ordered the opening sealed up again. Inside the cave were hundreds of clay jars filled with leather and papyrus scrolls. There were stacks of them everywhere, hidden in crevices, wedged between rocks. It looked like someone had used this cave as storage space. Now, that doesn't seem particularly exciting, but here's the thing. This was a remarkable place. It turns out that this cave is right next door to another famous cave that has already yielded important biblical manuscripts known as Cave 4. Cave 4 was discovered back in 1974, but the story of its discovery is almost as interesting as the scrolls themselves. See, the Bedouin were wandering around this area of the desert when they stumbled upon some caves. As far as we can tell, they had heard rumors of the caves and what they might contain, and so decided to go looking for them. Rumor turned out to be true. These caves were filled with jar after jar of leather and papyrus scrolls. There were so many that the Bedouins started throwing them away, breaking them on rocks, using them as toilets. Eventually, word got out to the authorities, and the Bedouin agreed to show them where they found these treasures. Now, much like today, in the 1970s, there was a lot of fighting in the region, and so the Israeli authorities were understandably suspicious of the Bedouin. They assumed the scrolls were nothing but a clever ruse, a way for the Bedouin to smuggle weapons and other contraband onto the Israeli side of the border. They searched high and low, but there was nothing in the scrolls. The artifacts were real, and they were important. The oldest of the scrolls date back to the 3rd century BCE, meaning they were created over 2,200 years ago. At the time, Judea was still under Persian rule. To put this into perspective, the Dead Sea Scrolls are roughly equivalent to us finding an ancient artifact from around the year 300 BCE. It would be like discovering a contemporary manuscript written during the lifetime of Alexander the Great. The same Alexander the Great who conquered the known world and whose statue sits in every self-respecting middle school courtyard. The sheer age of these artifacts was unbelievable. The second thing that was unbelievable was the condition. To understand how good their condition is, let's compare them to other artifacts from the period. Most documents from the ancient world have survived in fragments, often in pieces no larger than a sheet of paper. This is simply because the average document gets a lot of use. It's folded and unfolded, read and reread until it falls apart. A good example of this is the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the caves of Qumran and Nahal Hever. Their age and importance cannot be overstated. The scrolls include copies of nearly every book in the Old Testament. Some of these copies date back to the 2nd century BCE, meaning they were written at the same time as the books we now know as the Old Testament. In fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest copies of the Old Testament we have. The reason they were able to survive for so long is that they were kept dry and hidden away. One of the reasons we haven't found earlier copies of the Old Testament is that early Jewish communities tended to bury their scriptures, to store them safely in caves, far from prying eyes. That is what happened here, and it's part of the reason why the Dead Sea Scrolls are in such great shape. But what makes the recently discovered Cave 4 different is that they are in better shape than even the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of the texts are literally flawless. I mean, sure, they're covered in dirt and dust and centuries of dead skin, And yes, the leather is brittle, and in some cases the papyrus has started to decay, but once you brush off the centuries of grime, the text is perfectly legible. It's like opening up Shakespeare's first folio to read Hamlet for the first time. We've never seen anything like this before, not for this period of history. Most of the scrolls are legal documents, contracts, and business records from the time when Judea was ruled by the Hasmonean dynasty. There are also a handful of biblical manuscripts, including the oldest copy of Leviticus in existence. There are even a few non-biblical sectarian texts, writings from groups living in the region who were considered heretics by the Pharisees and Sadducees. These are the kinds of writings that helped shape our modern conception of Judaism. We wouldn't have these texts if not for this cave. All told, Cave 4 contains more than 600 manuscripts, and now, just down the road, Una Kim has found an even bigger cache of artifacts in Cave 4. You must be thinking, what's next? Are these caves just treasure troves of history? Well, unfortunately, no. The truth is, the second cave was completely empty, and as for the first cave, well, it looks like everything worth salvaging has already been taken. The only reason why they didn't destroy it in the process is that their hands were tied. You see, there's a legal agreement between Israel and Palestine that forbids both sides from conducting excavations without the other's permission. This means that while Una Kim can conduct research on the scrolls that have already been removed, she won't be able to go back into that first cave to look for more. The good news is that there are probably a lot more of these caves out there. There are dozens, maybe even hundreds of caves along this stretch of desert, and we've only explored a fraction of them. All of this material is being dated to the Second Temple period, the time when the First Temple, Solomon's Temple, stood in Jerusalem, and Jesus walked the earth. But why are these scrolls so important? Well, remember that the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest copies of the Old Testament that we have. But this material is older even than that. It gives us a window into the very origins of the Old Testament. For example, in addition to the manuscript of Leviticus that was discovered, Cave 4 also contains the oldest known copy of Exodus, Genesis, and Deuteronomy. Because these copies are so much older, they allow scholars to trace the evolution of the Old Testament back another couple hundred years. More than that, though, they fill in gaps in our understanding of Jewish history. We learn about sectarian beliefs and practices that were previously unknown. We discover the evolution of law and custom in early Judea, and we get a first-hand look at the society that Jesus was born into. In short, this discovery rewrites the history of the entire ancient Near East. So what happens next? Well, I'm glad you asked. The plan is to digitally scan every single scroll so that researchers around the world can access images of the artifacts. Of course, this will be done in collaboration with the Palestinian Authority and the Jordanian Department of Antiquities. The scans will be free to view online and will help scholars make new discoveries without having to leave their offices. In fact, the scans will be so detailed, you'll be able to zoom in and read the text for yourself. I hope that someday I'll be able to visit these caves myself and stand in awe of the actual artifacts. But until then, I'll have to settle for seeing them on the internet. If you enjoyed this video, check out the series in the description below. Every week, we bring you a new episode on the history of religion. And don't forget to subscribe so that we can notify you when the new episodes come out. It's day 36 of 120 days of studying the Bible. We're in the book of Isaiah today, and we'll look at Isaiah 30 through 33. But before we get there, if you've been with us for any length of time, you know that when we study the Bible, we don't just look at one passage, we look at it in its original language, its historical context, and see how it speaks to us today. And while we won't be looking at Dead Sea Scrolls today, I thought it might be fun if we took a moment and talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they helped us better understand the Bible we have today. Because these ancient manuscripts have revolutionized our understanding of the Old Testament, there are some interesting things you should know about them. First of all, the caves where they were found are located in a place called the West Bank, which is near Jerusalem and Bethlehem. There are 11 different caves, and the first cave discovered contained the oldest known copy of the entire Hebrew Bible. That's crazy. This is a little off topic, but I think you'll find this interesting. The cave itself soon became a target of fevered excavation. Official archaeologists, once notified by the Jordanian government, rushed in, though not fast enough to prevent many scrolls from being irreparably damaged, sliced into fragments, or sold off piece by piece. You can actually still buy pieces of those scrolls online if you have several $1,000s to spend, so maybe stay away from eBay. It's sketchy. Anyway, the site, perched above the ancient ruins of Qumran, became a battleground not just of discovery but of ideology and money. The scrolls were priceless, literally. And the question no one could yet answer was who had written them. Well, we know now that they were written by a group called the Essenes, and they lived around 2,000 years ago. They wanted to live a life of prayer and solitude, so they left the city and settled in the caves of Qumran. But what's really amazing is that these manuscripts are over 1,000 years older than anything else we have of the Old Testament. And here's why that's significant. Most of the Old Testament was written between 1400 BC and 400 BC. And up until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest manuscript we had was from around the year 1000. So we were missing almost 1,000 years of history. It was like trying to read a book but skipping every other page. So a lot of people assume that what we have in the Bible now is exactly what was originally written. But since we were missing so much of the text, scholars would fill in the gaps with what they thought probably happened based on what we did have. That meant that even though we had the Word of God, we weren't always sure which words were God's and which words were scholars'. But the Dead Sea Scrolls changed everything. When we compare the texts, we find that the Dead Sea Scrolls and our current texts are almost identical. In fact, of all the books of the Old Testament, only one book, the Book of Esther, has no significant differences between the Dead Sea Scrolls and what we have today. So the words are almost exactly the same, meaning God's Word has remained pure despite thousands of years of copying and recopying. Wow. Now, there are a few passages where the Dead Sea Scrolls disagree with what we have today, but upon further study, it turns out that in most cases the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually the ones who have errors and not our current translations. In fact, scholars say that in 90% of the variance between the Dead Sea Scrolls and our current translations, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the ones who got it wrong. So let's talk about some of those. First, John chapter 5, verse 8. In verse 8, the New International Version reads, "He himself testified, and the Father who sent him has testified." However, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it says, "He himself testified and the two angels who went before him." Now, does that mean that the Bible is wrong, and it was originally written with the words, "two angels"? No. As it turns out, the phrase, "two angels," was likely added later because it appears in a similar wording in another part of the Bible, but it wasn't an accurate quote of the original text. Another example is John chapter 7, verse 53, where the NIV says, "Each of them asked for a sign, and he performed a different miracle. But the Pharisees were not convinced, and the man's heart hardened." Again, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain a slightly different reading, saying, "They asked him for a sign, but he performed no miracle except that he fell on the ground and rolled up in pain and was cured." So, which one is right, the NIV or the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, most scholars agree that the shorter, simpler sentence is also the more accurate quote of the original text. In other words, the Dead Sea Scrolls have it wrong here. So why is this important? Because it shows us that the Bible we have today is actually quite reliable. What other books from that time period do we have that are so well preserved? The Iliad and the Odyssey, two famous poems attributed to Homer, have over 2,000 variations between the oldest known copies and the original text. The Iliad, for example, has 195 variant readings between its oldest known copies. If we applied the same standard of acceptance, we would have to reject the Iliad and the Odyssey as unreliable. Yet, we accept the New Testament without reservation because it has far fewer variants than ancient Greek literature. In fact, the book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible, has only one variant in all of the oldest copies, and that's a minor spelling change. Just think about that. The Bible was copied hundreds and hundreds of times over the course of 3,000 years, and aside from minor spelling changes, it has been passed down perfectly. That's nothing short of a miracle. So thank God for the Dead Sea Scrolls, not because they changed what we believe, but because they showed us how reliable the Bible we have today is. Okay, let's keep going. We looked at Isaiah 30 to 33 today, and there are a couple things you should know. First, in chapters 30 and 31, Isaiah prophesies against Israel, Judah, and Egypt. He accuses them of relying on alliances with Egypt and Assyria instead of trusting in God. He likens their plans to a bruised reed that will split, or a burning but extinguished coal. Then he promises that God will bring his people back to Mount Zion. Second, in chapter 32, he gives a beautiful description of the righteous king who will come from the line of King David. This king will be a banner for the nations and an emblem for the righteous. And third, in chapter 33, Isaiah continues his attack against those who trust in chariots and horses and human power. But then he ends the chapter on a positive note, promising that salvation will come from the one whom we least expect, the Lord God Almighty. You know, the other day I was listening to some worship music and the lyrics stuck in my head. My expectation was to trust in God, but your ways are higher than my ways, Lord. And I realized something. I tend to think that God will act in accordance to how I feel, that if I trust in God and walk in faith, then good things will happen. But sometimes God does other things too. Sometimes He allows me to go through hard times so that my faith is strengthened. Sometimes He leads me in directions I didn't want to go. Sometimes He allows people to treat me poorly so that I learn to rely on Him. Honestly, I don't like it. I wish it wasn't like that. But as I get older, I realize that sometimes His ways are indeed higher than my ways. And it's a good thing. What about you? How have you seen God work in your life in ways that you didn't expect? Let me know in the comment section. Hey, if you enjoyed today's lesson and you'd like to learn more about the Bible, check out the link below. Someone recorded a special message that you'll want to hear. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, take a second to click the subscribe button. Until next time, everyone, thanks for watching. In 1947, a young goat herder named Muhammad Saimuddin was playing with his goats near the cliffs of a dry and desolate canyon in the West Bank. One of the goats, more curious than the others, scrambled up to a niche in the cliff face and disappeared from view. Well, that was odd. So Muhammad climbed up after it, only to discover a few clay jars hidden in the crevice. He handed these over to a local archaeologist who found that they contained papyrus scrolls, and those scrolls would soon become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. But here's what's crazy. Even though these finds were extremely exciting, one scholar in particular was deeply unsettled by them. And, until recently, we had no idea why. What did he know that we don't? To find out, let's take a trip back to biblical times. It was about 100 CE, and the Jewish people had been scattered across the Mediterranean. They still held out hope for a Messiah who would liberate them from their oppressors, but their hopes were pinned on different candidates. Some expected a warrior king like David, a military leader who would unite the people of Israel and defeat their enemies. Others hoped for a spiritual leader, a teacher who would guide them toward righteousness and bring about a golden age of peace. The idea of Jesus as the Messiah was actually pretty radical for the time, since it fit neither of these expectations. This is because Jesus didn't look or behave like the Jewish Messiah. He didn't come from a royal line. He didn't conquer an empire. He taught his followers to turn the other cheek. And while some of his disciples were initially prepared to fight for him, he told them, "Put your swords back in their places, for all who take the sword will die by the sword." Still, millions of Christians today believe that he is the Messiah. So how did this happen? Well, after Jesus died, His followers wrote down his teachings and stories about him. But they weren't writing from a position of power. They were persecuted and even imprisoned for their beliefs. Yet somehow this text survived, passed down through secret networks, possibly including the very people who'd hidden these scrolls. Let's rewind to 1947 and see how the discovery of these texts changed everything. It was a pivotal moment for biblical studies. Until then, the oldest texts scholars had to work with were medieval copies of Scripture. Now they had documents written by hands long before Christianity emerged. But that also meant that there was a lot riding on the contents of these texts. If any of them challenged the biblical canon, contradicted key theological doctrines, or hinted at alternative messianic expectations, well, that wasn't just a matter of history. That was spiritual dynamite. One scholar in particular was shaken to his core, so much so that he kept secret what he learned for the next 35 years. His name was Father Roland H. Murphy, and he was a Catholic priest and professor of Old Testament studies at the Catholic Biblical Association of America. As soon as Murphy saw the newly discovered scrolls, he realized something. These weren't just relics of the past. They were living documents that could change the way we understand the Bible. So he got to work translating them, poring over every word and comparing them to existing texts. But as he read, he became increasingly uneasy. That is because many of the Dead Sea Scrolls contained books that didn't make it into the modern Bible. Take, for example, the Book of Enoch, a collection of pseudepigraphal texts attributed to the biblical patriarch Enoch. Or the Testament of Abraham, a text that tells the story of Abraham's life, complete with miracles and revelations not found in Genesis. Then there are the Damascus document and the Community Manual, which offer insights into the sectarian beliefs and practices of the community that lived near Qumran. These texts weren't in the Bible because they were written after the canon had been closed, after the books that we have now had been agreed upon and codified. But that meant that they shed light on the biblical world in ways that no one had ever imagined, and the implications were both fascinating and disturbing. Take the Book of Enoch, for example. This text wasn't just popular among early Christians, it was considered canonical by some groups. In other words, they believed it was on par with the books of the Bible. Similarly, the Testament of Abraham was widely circulated in early Christian communities, even though it didn't make the cut for the New Testament. Now, you might be thinking, who cares if these books were popular? They're obviously not in the Bible for a reason. But here's the thing. Father Murphy realized that these texts were challenging the very foundations of biblical authority. If these books were considered sacred by some Christians, then what made the books in our Bibles so special? Was it just because they were older, or because they had more influence, or was there some other, more mysterious force at play? And then there were the sectarian texts like the Damascus document and the Community Manual. These texts offered a glimpse into the beliefs and practices of a small, isolated group of Jews living near Qumran. But they also raised troubling questions. What did it mean for a text to be considered sacred? And what role did authority and power play in shaping religious traditions? For example, the Damascus document lays out the beliefs of the sect known as the Essenes, a Jewish group that lived near Qumran in the Second Temple period. It describes their interpretation of Jewish law and their understanding of the coming Messiah. But it also hints at their apocalyptic beliefs, their fears of persecution, and their desire for a better world. In other words, it shows us that the people who created these scrolls weren't just religious fanatics. They were real people with complex beliefs and a deep desire for justice and peace. Meanwhile, the Community Manual is a set of rules and regulations for the Qumran community. It covers everything from how to elect leaders to how to deal with internal conflicts. But it also reveals a lot about the daily life of the community. For example, it mentions agricultural work, meals, and even clothing. And that gives us a rare window into the daily life of a Jewish community in the Second Temple period. These texts, along with the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, forced biblical scholars to confront the limitations of their own perspectives and the biases that shaped their understanding of the past. They showed that the biblical world was more complex and nuanced than they'd ever imagined, and that the people who lived in that world were more like them than they'd realized. So, what was Father Murphy so afraid of? Well, as he delved deeper and deeper into these texts, he began to realize that they challenged everything he thought he knew about the Bible and about God. He discovered that the people who wrote these scrolls weren't always on the same page, that they argued and disagreed and even fought with each other. He also found that their beliefs were often at odds with the teachings of Jesus and the early Christians, that they wrestled with the same questions of faith and doubt that plague us even today. In short, they were real people with real problems and real doubts, and their struggles to make sense of their faith shook Father Murphy to his core. He realized that the Bible wasn't just a collection of timeless truths, but a record of a people's journey toward understanding. It was a journey marked by mistakes, doubts, and even moments of despair. And yet, these people, living in a world vastly different from our own, had managed to grapple with the same questions that have haunted humanity since the beginning of time. What is the nature of good and evil? What is the source of human suffering? And what is the meaning of life in a world that often seems senseless and cruel? Their struggles were a reminder that the journey of faith is never easy, but also that it is a journey worth taking. As Father Murphy pored over these ancient texts, he began to see the Bible in a new light. He realized that it wasn't just a book to be read, but a story to be lived. A story about a people who struggled and doubted and ultimately found meaning and hope in their faith. But he kept his thoughts to himself for 35 years, afraid of the reaction of the church and the broader scholarly community. It wasn't until 1982, when he was nearing the end of his career, that he finally published his groundbreaking work on the Dead Sea Scrolls. In it, he shared his insights on the sectarian literature and argued for a new understanding of the Bible as a dynamic and evolving text. Sadly, Father Murphy didn't live to see the full impact of his work. He passed away in 1985. But his legacy lives on in the way that scholars and theologians think about the Bible today. He showed us that the past isn't just something to be studied, but a conversation that echoes through time, and that the voices of those who came before us still have something to say to us today. One peculiar scroll would soon be nicknamed the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. Another spoke cryptically of a teacher of righteousness and a wicked priest. Yet another used the phrase Son of God in a way that felt a little too familiar, but that came later. For now, there was only the thrill of a long-buried past cracking open. And, like the first scrolls, the early assessments were cautiously wrapped in uncertainty. It's me. This is the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you're watching this channel. The year is 1952. Almost 2 decades have passed since the initial discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the world has become a very different place. War has been declared and won, and peace treaties are being signed. A new medium called television is taking the world by storm. Movies are bigger, music is wilder, and people are starting to shed the restrictive fashions of the previous decades for something a bit more fun. And in a small Judean desert cave, a group of men are arguing over some old books. It's not exactly clear how these men found the cave, or even if they did find it in the same way that Muhammad found his lost sandals. But what they do know is that they have stumbled upon what appears to be one of the last remaining Gnostic sects in the world. And the sect, much like the Essenes before them, keeps their abode well hidden away from prying eyes. So the argument quickly turns to violence. One man is shot in the leg and then everyone leaves. At least that's according to one account of this bizarre event. Other accounts say that the fighting started before they even found the cave, or that no one was hurt at all. But the details are hazy at best. What is ent is that the cave contained the largest collection of ancient texts ever found, and with them, the world would get an unprecedented look into the origins of Christianity. The majority of the texts date back to between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century CE, which means they predate the destruction of the Second Temple and the subsequent diaspora of the Jewish people. They also predate the rise of early Christianity, and so offer a unique perspective on the relationship between Judaism and the new religion that broke away from it. In other words, scholars could finally start to figure out where Jesus got his ideas. But let's go back to the beginning. What makes this collection of ancient texts so special? Let's start with the obvious. The caves themselves are a remarkable archaeological find. While we have plenty of ancient ruins, buildings and artifacts left over from the days of Jesus and the Essenes, actual written documents from this time period are few and far between. There are a couple of reasons for this. For one thing, paper was expensive and difficult to make, so documents were usually written on papyrus, leather, or stone. These materials don't tend to preserve as well as clay tablets or stone carvings. Secondly, during biblical times, most people couldn't read or write. So literacy was almost exclusively limited to the elite class, which meant fewer documents were produced to begin with. It wasn't until the invention of the printing press that books became cheap enough for the masses, and we entered the age of mass media. You can thank Johannes Gutenberg for your ability to watch this video on YouTube right now. Because of these factors, surviving documents from the Second Temple period are extremely rare, making the Dead Sea Scrolls perhaps the most important collection of ancient books in human history. The first cave alone contained more manuscripts than the previous half-century of archaeological discoveries. It's like finding Shakespeare's lost works in a shoebox under your bed, only a lot more dusty. But why are these texts so exciting? Well, for starters, there's simply a lot of them. Over the years, 11 caves in the area have been identified as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls complex, and while the first few caves had already been plundered by treasure hunters, the other 8 are remarkably intact, containing nearly 10,000 manuscripts. This gives us a wealth of information about daily life in the Judean desert during the Second Temple period. We can learn about trade, politics, culture, and religious beliefs. We can see how people lived, worked, and played, and all of that without leaving the comfort of our favorite armchairs. But if we're being honest with ourselves, the main reason why people like the Dead Sea Scrolls so much is because they hold the key to the origins of Christianity. To understand why, we have to take a closer look at the contents of the caves. Cave 1, discovered in 1947, kicked things off with a bang. It contained the oldest copy of the Book of Isaiah ever found, as well as portions of other books from the Old Testament, including Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Habakkuk. The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic community and made headlines around the world. For the first time, researchers could compare the ancient texts directly with the modern versions and work out how Christianity gradually diverged from its Jewish roots. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Cave 4, discovered in 1952, turned out to contain a complete copy of the Hebrew Bible, making it the oldest such manuscript ever found. It also contained a copy of the Book of Enoch, an apocalyptic text that is not part of the Hebrew Bible but was very popular among early Christians. In fact, several other non-biblical Christian texts were also found at Qumran, including the Community Rule, a set of ethical guidelines for members of the sect, and the Hodayot, a hymn of thanksgiving that some scholars believe may have inspired parts of the Lord's Prayer. Now, here's where things get weird. In addition to their religious writings, the inhabitants of Qumran also left behind mundane items like pottery, tools, and weapons. We have evidence of their diet, everyday life, and social customs. But what's really interesting is that none of these objects have any connection to Christianity. There's no crucifixes, no Bibles, not even a single reference to Jesus. In fact, the only mention of him in any of the Dead Sea Scrolls is a single word that appears on a broken pottery shard. It's hardly a smoking gun, but it does lend credence to the idea that the sect at Qumran may have been a real-life version of the Essenes described in the New Testament, a Jewish sect that withdrew from society in order to live according to the laws of Moses. But if the Essenes were supposed to be the historical basis for Christianity, Why is there no mention of Jesus? Well, the answer may lie in another enigmatic reference in the scrolls. One particular scroll would soon be nicknamed the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. Another spoke cryptically of a teacher of righteousness and a wicked priest. Yet another used the phrase Son of God in a way that felt a little too familiar. But that came later. For now, there was only the thrill of a long-buried past cracking open. And like the first scrolls, the early assessments were cautiously wrapped in uncertainty. As more and more scholars examined the texts, however, the connection to Christianity became increasingly clear. The teacher of righteousness, whoever he was, sounds suspiciously like Jesus. The sons of darkness may have been the Jewish leadership who crucified him. And the wicked priest could have been Caiaphas, the high priest at the time of Jesus' death. But who were the sons of light? Some scholars believe that this refers to the followers of the aforementioned teacher of righteousness, a.k.a. Jesus. Others think it may refer to the Essenes themselves, a peaceful community living in the desert and shunning violence. There's some evidence to support both theories. On the one hand, the Dead Sea Scrolls show that the Essenes were well aware of the political situation in Judea and took an active role in local affairs. They certainly weren't the pacifist hermits that earlier scholars believed them to be. On the other hand, it's hard to ignore the similarities between the teacher of righteousness and Jesus. Both were Jewish preachers who attracted large crowds and preached about the coming of God's kingdom. Both were eventually murdered by the religious authorities, and both were believed to be divine, although the term Son of God is used much more liberally in the Dead Sea Scrolls than it is in the New Testament. Of course, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, the fact that the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls happened in modern-day Israel, and that many of the people involved were members of the Israeli military. Could there be a connection between the creation of modern Israel and the ancient Jewish state? Maybe, but it's a topic that's far too controversial for us to dive into today. So let's wrap things up by returning to where we started. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered by a teenage boy named Muhammad. He stumbled across the cave quite by accident and changed history forever. Or maybe he didn't. There are rumors that the scrolls were actually discovered by a group of Bedouin goat herders, but those stories can't be verified. What is certain, however, is that the Dead Sea Scrolls are the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century. They've revolutionized our understanding of the origins of Christianity and helped pave the way for modern biblical studies. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Why here? Why bury a library in remote caves above a ruin barely known to history? This is the question that every archaeologist and most certainly every treasure hunter has asked themselves when confronted with the discovery of a lifetime. A cache of nearly 1,000 clay jars containing some 20,000 ancient Hebrew scrolls was uncovered at the site of Qumran National Park near the Dead Sea between 1947 and 1956. The largest collection of these ancient texts was found in Cave 1, a naturally occurring fissure in the Judean desert overlooking a desolate valley over 2 miles from the nearest inhabited place. When someone first pried open those jars and unrolled those brittle scrolls, an entire world came tumbling out. We saw ancient lamps crafted of clay and stone. We watched farmers tilling their fields and shepherds guiding their flocks. We listened to priests intoning blessings and curses, kings issuing decrees and prophets delivering messages from God. It was like stepping back in time. No, not like stepping back in time. It was stepping back in time. Suddenly, we could hear the words of one of the oldest living books in the Bible being read aloud for the first time since the days of Jesus. It was also pretty obvious that whoever hid these scrolls knew exactly how and where to hide them. They chose places so barren and inhospitable that they would discourage discovery for centuries, perhaps even millennia. In fact, only 2 of the 11 caves where these artifacts were discovered showed signs of human habitation. The others, including the largest cache of scrolls, were hidden in places where it would have been very difficult for someone to survive. So why did they choose such inconvenient places? Why here? Well, before we get into the reasons scholars have proposed for hiding the Dead Sea Scrolls in such inhospitable places, let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. For over 150 years, the oldest surviving manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, which Christians today call the Old Testament, were those housed in the Leningrad Codex, which dates to around 1000 CE, and the Aleppo Codex, which dates to the 9th or 10th century CE. That's all well and good, but a manuscript dating to 1000 CE is going to look vastly different than one written 3,000 years ago. For one thing, the languages will look completely different. For another, we are looking at the work of scribes who lived after the destruction of the Second Temple and after the advent of Christianity. As such, scholars have long suspected that there might be older manuscripts of the biblical text somewhere out there. But they didn't expect to find anything older than the Masoretic text, which was standardized in the 6th century BCE. Enter the Dead Sea Scrolls. When archaeologists began excavating the caves of Qumran, they discovered that the oldest manuscripts they had discovered so far were easily 1,000 years older than what was available to them before. They now had manuscripts that were roughly 2,000 years old. But the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't just limited to the books of the Hebrew Bible. Cave 4 contained the oldest copy of the book of Isaiah ever discovered, which dates to the year 125 BCE. But this wasn't the only surprise that awaited the excavators. As they continued to dig, they realized that they were discovering multiple copies of what scholars would come to call the sectarian books. These were writings attributed to a Jewish sect who withdrew from society and lived in isolated communities away from other Jews. In particular, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain the oldest copies of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all dating to roughly the turn of the millennium. In total, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain portions of every book of the Hebrew Bible except the Book of Esther. Not only that, but the sectarian books teach a theology wildly different from that of later rabbinic Judaism. They tell of a coming Messiah who would rule over Israel from Mount Zion in Jerusalem. They speak of a war between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, and of a final judgment wherein the wicked will be consigned to eternal torment, while the righteous enter into eternal life. In other words, the sectarian books reflect a theology closer to that of early Christianity than that of traditional Judaism. It's no wonder, then, that the sect known as the Essenes made preserving these books their highest priority. Wait, what? The Essenes? The group responsible for writing the Dead Sea Scrolls is actually unknown, despite some attempts to identify them with various groups like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians. None of those groups fit all of the descriptions contained in the sectarian books. Many scholars believe that the community that created them were the same as the sect called the Essenes, which is mentioned by the Roman historian Pliny the Younger. But there is no consensus on this issue. But who were the Essenes? Unfortunately for scholars, the Essenes left almost no historical record behind, so our knowledge of them comes almost entirely from non-Essene sources like the historians Josephus Flavius and Pliny the Younger. According to Josephus, the Essenes were a Jewish sect that existed alongside the Pharisees and Sadducees during the Hasmonean and Herodian periods, that is between the years 140 BCE and 40 CE. He described them as men who lived a solitary life, renouncing both marriage and politics. They believed in a personal God who revealed his will through dreams and visions and practiced a form of ascetic discipline that involved abstaining from meat, wine, and other pleasures of the flesh. Pliny the Younger, the Roman governor of Bithynia and Pontus, also wrote of the Essenes. In a letter to the Emperor Trajan, he expressed his concern over their large numbers and their strange customs, which included living nude, avoiding oaths, and never killing any living creature. According to Pliny, they lived together in communes, had no possessions in common, wore simple clothing, and ate a vegetarian diet. He also claimed that they had a healing herb which they used to cure diseases, and he wondered if the Jewish revolt against Rome might have its origins with the Essenes. However, Pliny's account is somewhat suspect because he makes several mistakes. For example, he says that the Essenes lived in Judea, which is inaccurate. Although the term Judea means beyond the Jordan, the Essenes actually lived beyond the Dead Sea in the area of Ein Feshka. Pliny also claimed that the Essenes were numerous, but contemporary sources indicate that they were actually quite rare. So, who were the Essenes? Well, that's a question that has yet to be answered because although they are mentioned throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls, they never refer to themselves by that name. As such, the main source for their identity comes from an ostracon discovered in Nahal Hever. An ostracon is simply a piece of pottery with something written on it. In this case, the ostracon reads, "the property of Shimon bar Kochava," which tells us that this person owned this jar. But what's interesting is that the second part of the inscription reads, "the Mesorian," which is the name of a particular Essene community. So we can safely assume that whoever owned this jar was a member of the Essenes. However, we don't know much else about him, except that he was probably literate. Some scholars suggest that the owner of the jar might have been the one who wrote the sectarian books, but there is no evidence to support this theory. Nevertheless, we can glean a few details about the Essenes from the books themselves. For one thing, they seem to have been very strict about who could read their sacred writings. In order to prevent outsiders from defiling their scrolls, they required that readers be circumcised and ritually pure. They also believed that the books should be read aloud, which may explain why they buried them in caves rather than hiding them in some secret chamber within a building. By burying the books underground, the Essenes could ensure that they would be preserved for future generations. After all, they believed that the end of the age was drawing near, and they wanted to make sure that their books survived the coming judgment. But why hide them in such inhospitable places? The answer to this question lies in the theology of the sect. Like the early Christians, the Essenes expected the end of the world to come suddenly and unexpectedly. They believed that a great tribulation would occur first, however, and that only the righteous would survive it. To prepare for this tribulation, they withdrew from society and took up residence in caves in the Judean desert. Here they lived in small communities, probably led by charismatic prophets who guided them in the study of their sacred books. They probably spent their days farming, herding animals and making pottery, and their nights telling stories and singing songs around a campfire. Life for the Essenes was probably very simple and austere, but it was also very meaningful. They believed that they were living in the presence of God, and that gave their lives purpose. They didn't need much in the way of material possessions, because they knew that the things of this world were not important in the sight of God. What mattered was their relationship with Him. And that brings us back to the scrolls. The Essenes didn't just write down their theology, they lived it. Their way of life was a constant reminder of their beliefs. And when they felt that the end of the age was approaching, they decided to preserve their way of life by burying their books in caves throughout the Judean desert. They knew that their communities would eventually be destroyed, but they hoped that their books would survive and that one day they would be discovered by future generations. In this way, the Essenes have left us with a priceless gift, a window into the past that has allowed us to see what life was like in ancient Judea. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, check out our podcast, where we bring you new episodes every week on your favorite platforms. Leave a like and subscribe, and leave us a comment below with your ideas of topics that we should cover in the future. So you may have heard the Bible story about how Moses went up to the top of Mount Nebo and got a preview of the Promised Land, but then died before he could get in. Well, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the discovery that turned that story upside down. It was 1947, and a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad, looking for a lost goat, stumbled across some caves near the cliffs at a place called Khirbet Qumran. In those caves, he found some clay jars. Inside those jars were some papyrus scrolls and some pieces of parchment wrapped in linen and sealed with wax. Among them, one scroll in particular caught his eye. He unrolled it and started reading. It began with the word, "in the beginning," which he recognized from the Bible. It couldn't be a coincidence. Surely this must be part of a lost book of the Bible. So he sold the rest of the scrolls to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem and kept this one for himself. But as the story goes, the jar containing the other scrolls caught the attention of an Irish monk who purchased them, brought them back to his monastery, and presented them to his abbot. Now, the abbot wasn't really sure what to do with these strange old scrolls, so he handed them off to the one person he knew who might know what to do with them. That man was Father Roland de Vaux, a French Dominican friar who specialized in studying ancient Jewish manuscripts. When de Vaux saw the collection of scrolls, his jaw dropped. These weren't just religious texts. They were unique and represented a treasure trove of ancient history. The oldest dated to around 250 BCE and the latest to around 68 CE, meaning they predated the earliest manuscript copies of the Bible by nearly 1,000 years. They included 13 complete books of the Hebrew Bible, more than half of the books in the Old Testament. There were also works not included in the biblical canon, writings considered heretical or not relevant enough to the central message of Jesus Christ. For Christians, there were also sectarian writings, including some previously unknown works attributed to figures like Enoch and Noah. In addition to being 1,000 years older than the next oldest manuscripts, these scrolls were written in Hebrew, unlike the Greek translations that dominated at the time. Scholars initially thought that they might date to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Perhaps a scribe grabbed some holy books and hid them in a cave in order to preserve them, only to die and never retrieve them. But there was something about the site where they were discovered that didn't fit this narrative. Those caves were perched precariously on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Dead Sea, a place so desolate that it became known as the Valley of the Moon. And there were no signs of human habitation. Where were the houses? Where were the latrines? Where were the garbage dumps? And why would someone go to such a remote, inhospitable place to hide the sacred texts? That theory, once fringe, gained weight when archaeologists uncovered the remains of Qumran itself just below the cliffs. Ruined structures, communal spaces, water channels, purification pools, and most intriguingly, a scriptorium, a room for copying texts, tables, inkwells, benches, all baked under the same punishing desert heat. This was no shepherd's camp. It was a community, literate, isolated, obsessed with law and ritual purity, and writing. The scrolls, it appeared, had not merely been hidden here. They had likely been written here, copied, preserved, and perhaps protected. Now, to fully appreciate the significance of this discovery, it helps to understand the historical context. From the time of Nehemiah in the 5th century BCE until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Jewish religious and political life was dominated by two factions. The Pharisees were one of these groups. We tend to think of Pharisees as villains, hypocrites who betrayed Jesus and pestered him with legalistic demands. But it's important to remember that the Gospels were written from a particular perspective. In those texts, the Pharisees come off badly because they represent a rival school of thought that rejected Jesus' teachings. If you read the Hebrew Bible, though, you find that the Pharisees are regularly cast in a positive light. In fact, some scholars suggest that the Pharisees were so influential that many of the ethical and ritual laws in the New Testament actually originated with them. But Pharisees were not the only group shaping Judaism at the time. The Sadducees held considerable power, too. They ran the Jerusalem temple and attracted many members of the ruling class. Like the Pharisees, the Sadducees believed in the Hebrew Bible, but they differed on some key points. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, immortality of the soul, or in a number of eschatological beliefs, that is, beliefs about the end times. Scholars speculate that this difference can be traced back to their respective locations. The Sadducees lived in Jerusalem and catered to the interests of merchants and landowners. They thus tended to focus on the law as it pertained to daily life. Meanwhile, the Pharisees arose in the northern regions of Galilee and Judea, far from the economic and political intrigues of Jerusalem. As a result, they were more interested in the apocalyptic prophecies of the Hebrew Bible. But who were the people of Qumran? What was their relationship to these various schools of thought? Today, historians refer to the members of this community as the sectarians, and they are most often synonymous with the term Essene. Although that term comes from the Bible, it doesn't appear anywhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know from the texts that the members of the community referred to themselves as the children of light, and they identified their opponents as the children of darkness. They seem to have been an apocalyptic millenarian group waiting for the imminent arrival of the Messiah and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. Their library contained copies of every book of the Hebrew Bible except Esther, along with sectarian writings that explored their distinctive beliefs and practices. One of these was the community rule, a set of guidelines for living that defined the group's standards of purity and conduct. Members of the sect pledged to live by the law of Moses, but they went much further. They established a rigid system of ritual purity and practiced ascetic self-discipline. The rules outlined the requirements for joining the group. A male applicant had to be circumcised, and a female applicant had to be a virgin. Once admitted, men and women alike had to observe strict standards of hygiene, abstain from sexual relations and all intoxicants, and submit to a trial period of confession and testing. Violators of these rules faced banishment from the community and confiscation of their property. Interestingly, the sect did allow non-Jews to join, so long as they converted to the group's beliefs and conformed to its practices. But the sectarians weren't just concerned with their own behavior. They also judged the behavior of others harshly, labeling anyone who did not conform to their beliefs as children of darkness. They wrote extensively against the Pharisees and the Sadducees, accusing them of violating the law. They also expressed particular vitriol towards a third group, the Herodians. This group was named for Herod the Great, the client king of Judea during the late Second Temple period. Under his rule and that of his successors, the Herodians served as intermediaries between the Jews and the Roman Empire. While this alliance suited the pragmatic Sadducees, it rankled the sectarians, who refused to swear allegiance to anyone except God. According to the sectarians, the leaders of Israel had been corrupted by worldly concerns and were disqualified from leading the people. Only the sectarians, it seemed, were fit to study and interpret the law and prepare the way for the coming Messiah. Thus, although we sometimes lump them together as a single group, it makes sense to see the sectarians as another school of thought within Second Temple Judaism, alongside the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Each group had its own ideas about how to follow the law, and each had a devoted following. The Pharisees attracted many from the general populace, while the Sadducees appealed to the wealthy elite. And the sectarians, well, they sought to establish a pure community of believers, free from the influence of wealth, politics, and worldly distractions. Unfortunately for them, that dream was cut short in the 1st century CE. When Roman forces invaded and destroyed the town, killing or scattering the residents, perhaps some escaped to the nearby caves, bringing their precious texts with them. Perhaps others hid the scrolls in the caves to protect them from the enemy. Whatever happened, we will never know. But the sectarian community seems to have disappeared around 70 CE, never to be seen again. Yet their ideas lived on in the pages of the Dead Sea Scrolls, offering us a window into a forgotten way of life. And maybe if we read their words with an open mind, we can learn something about ourselves in the process. What did you find most interesting about the sectarians? Let me know in the comments, and while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe. It helps bring these videos to more people and allows us to keep making them. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Welcome to my channel. We're all familiar with the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. But have you ever stopped to wonder about the people who wrote these texts? Who were the authors of the oldest surviving pieces of biblical manuscripts? Why did they write the way they did? And why do we still have so many questions about them today? Here's what we know about the desert scribes. But who were they? these desert scribes who had left behind hundreds of scrolls, yet no names. Some claimed they were Essenes, a Jewish sect mentioned by ancient authors like Josephus and Philo. Others weren't so sure. The content of the scrolls was radical, messianic, apocalyptic. Some of it even resembled early Christian language, which, understandably, made some people very uncomfortable, including reportedly those who had access to certain scrolls and chose not to publish them right away. That silence, too, would become part of the mystery. The scrolls spoke in riddles, but the hands that wrote them remained nameless. No sect name, no authorial boasts, not even a date that could be anchored without guesswork. Just line after line of inked law, prophecy, and cosmic tension preserved so carefully, one could almost imagine the scribes had known their words were meant to survive fire and empire. And yet there is good reason to believe the answer to this question is not as simple as a name or a label. As we look at the available evidence, several things stand out. First, the sheer volume of material. Hundreds of manuscripts containing tens of thousands of fragments cover every major book of the Hebrew Bible except Esther. With the exception of the great Isaiah scroll, most of the biblical books are represented by multiple witnesses. This level of copying points to an organized effort, not merely the scribblings of a fringe group. Second, the quality of the manuscripts themselves is remarkable. They display meticulous attention to detail, indicating scribes who took great pride in their work. The tiny script may be hard to decipher, but it's also incredibly neat. Third, the content is often heavily redacted. This means that these texts were copied and recopied over generations, with changes being made in the margins before being incorporated into the main text. This process was common in Jewish tradition, but it's not something any cult would have done. Finally, the community appears to have lasted for centuries. Even if its origins can be traced back to the Second Temple period, it clearly survived the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE and continued to thrive until the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE. This longevity argues against a group defined by a single charismatic leader who could easily die, disappear, or be co-opted. Instead, let's consider the possibility that what we're really looking at here is a school or a movement of like-minded individuals united by a common goal, preserving the scriptures as they understood them. What was that understanding? A close reading of the texts suggests two answers. 1. The law. From the earliest days of the movement, its members were committed to studying and living according to the Mosaic law. In fact, the discovery of a legal manual among the scrolls shows that the community had its own system of courts and judges. They called this practice halakha, literally meaning the path. Their commitment to the law set them apart from other Jews who had begun to relax its requirements during the Second Temple period. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes each offered their own interpretations, but the sect of Qumran seems to have clung fiercely to the Torah's original intent, so much so that some scholars believe they practiced a form of ritual purity known as the Way of the Strict. One manuscript even refers to a meeting between some of its members and a prominent sage named Shimon ben Shatzatai. If this figure is identical to the famous Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, then we know he belonged to a circle that valued the oral Torah alongside the written word. While the Pharisees were known for collecting and codifying these oral traditions, it seems likely that the community at Qumran shared many of the same beliefs. But there's more to the story than just strict observance. 2. Messianism. Unlike the Pharisees, whose hopes for a Messiah were political, the sect of Qumran looked for a divine warrior who would inaugurate a new world. They believed that the current age was coming to an end and that God would soon intervene in history to restore his people to the land of Israel. The oldest scroll discovered at Qumran contains a hymn that looks forward to this decisive moment when the hidden Messiah will reveal himself and his reward will come upon him. This eschatology, a study of the end times, is present throughout the entire corpus of writings. There are dozens of references to the coming judgment and the renewal of the world, as well as the rise of a final generation that will usher in this new reality. Such convictions would not have been out of place in a Jewish context. After all, the idea of a divine king descended from David was popular in apocalyptic circles. But the sect of Qumran took this one step further. For them, the Messiah was a warrior, a conquering hero who would lead Israel into a glorious future. And he wouldn't come alone. He would be accompanied by angels. Now, the question arises, who were these heavenly beings, and how did they fit into the plans of the sect? Unfortunately, the evidence is often contradictory and difficult to interpret. On the one hand, we have references to fallen angels who rebelled against God and mated with human women, producing giant offspring known as Nephilim. These fallen angels are cast as the villains of the cosmic drama, tempting humankind away from the righteous path. Yet, at the same time, we have other references to an angelic order that fights on behalf of the righteous. These heavenly beings serve as God's emissaries, delivering messages and protecting the elect. It seems that the sect of Qumran inherited a belief in guardian angels, a common feature of Jewish angelology, but they took this doctrine in a new direction. Instead of seeing these spirits as individual guides, they conceptualized them as a heavenly army divided into ranks and hierarchies, each with its own assignments and responsibilities. This angelology didn't appear out of nowhere. It had roots in the Old Testament, where we see similar descriptions of angelic activity. For example, the book of Daniel speaks of a great prince, Michael, who stands up for the people of Israel and fights against the forces of Persia. Or the book of Enoch, which describes the fallen angels who rebelled against heaven and were cast into darkness. By drawing upon these narratives, the sect of Qumran created a rich mythology that gave structure to their understanding of the cosmos. As we weave together these various threads, a picture emerges that challenges easy categorization. Yes, there are parallels with the Essenes, especially their commitment to the law and their interest in spirituality, but there are also significant differences. The sect of Qumran was more apocalyptic, more militant and more rigidly structured than any known Essene sect. Moreover, the term Essene only appears twice in the entire corpus of Qumran manuscripts, and neither reference is self-descriptive. It's possible that the community referred to itself by a different name, one that has been lost to history. But, in the absence of evidence, calling them Essenes would be anachronistic at best and misleading at worst. Instead, perhaps we should follow the lead of one scholar who suggested the term desert scribes as a temporary label until such time as more information comes to light. But what does this mean for our understanding of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Are they simply the writings of a fringe group that played no significant role in the development of Judaism? Not at all. In fact, the opposite is true. The sect of Qumran may have been small in number and short-lived as a distinct entity, but its impact was far-reaching. Its members copied and studied the Torah more extensively than any other group, preserving ancient texts that would otherwise have been lost. Its interpretation of Scripture influenced later rabbinic Judaism in ways both big and small, and its apocalyptic theology laid the groundwork for the emergence of Christianity. Without the sect of Qumran, our access to the Hebrew Bible would be severely limited. Our understanding of Jewish thought during the Second Temple period would be woefully incomplete, and the New Testament would lack one of its most important literary precedents. So, to answer the question posed at the beginning of this video, who were the desert scribes? We have to say that like the ancient authors of the Bible they studied so faithfully, they were people like us deeply devoted to their scriptures, eager to preserve them for future generations, and willing to make incredible sacrifices to achieve that goal. Their story reminds us that faith is never simple. Even those who walk the straightest path are often misunderstood and their motives misconstrued. Yet in the end, it's their actions that speak the loudest. Through their example, the desert scribes teach us the power of commitment and the importance of preserving the wisdom of the past for the benefit of the present and future generations. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. The Dead Sea Scrolls have been called the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. When the first cave was discovered back in 1947, everybody wanted to know, who were the Dead Sea Scrolls written by? As it turns out, that question is a lot harder to answer than you might think. We have an inkling from one of the more obscure biblical manuscripts found in the caves, but it's a partial answer at best. And when it comes to these mysterious Jewish texts written around the time of Jesus, there are plenty of suspects to go around. Over the decades, scholars have blamed the Samaritans, the Herodians, the Pharisees, even the Essenes. But of all these supposed culprits, the Essenes are by far the most intriguing. In this video, we're going to explore why they are so often cited as the Dead Sea Scrolls people and what evidence, if any, we have for their involvement. You can probably tell just from looking at it that this isn't a very flashy artifact. It's a bit of papyrus glued onto some wood, and it's covered in what looks like random little scratches. What makes it special is what it says. Because despite their seeming simplicity, these markings are actually musical notes. And this piece of wood is a kind of guitar called a kithara. So, put together, they form a simple instrument. But that's not all, because this particular guitar was found inside one of the Dead Sea Scrolls caves, Cave 1, back in 1952. And thanks to the painstaking efforts of scholars over the decades, we know exactly which sect of Jews were responsible for this lovely bit of music making. They're known today as the Essenes. That's because this kithara helped us identify them thanks to a quote from a Roman-era Jewish philosopher named Philo of Alexandria. In his writing, he mentions a sect living in the Judean desert who made music like this. And according to another writer, they sang while they worked, likely as part of a purification ritual. Both clues fit the Essenes perfectly, which is part of why they make such good Dead Sea Scrolls suspects. But that's not all. See, the thing about solving mysteries is that you usually have a body count, a crime scene, and a list of potential suspects. Then you try to narrow down the list by finding a motive, means, and opportunity. Then, ideally, you get your fingerprints, pull up their criminal record, and boom, you have a perp. Only sometimes things aren't that neat and tidy, especially when it comes to ancient history. For example, nobody knows for sure how many authors or groups contributed to the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's also hard to come up with a neat list of suspects because many of the relevant groups lived at the same time and in the same place. Take, for example, the group we usually associate with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the community at Qumran. Scholars used to assume that they were a sect of Pharisees. However, we now know that Qumran was a separate community from the larger Jewish population, living on the coast of the Dead Sea, around 10 minutes south of Masada. They followed strict rules. Members of the community seem to have shared everything: food, clothing, even wives. And they left behind lots of scrolls. But attributing the Dead Sea Scrolls to them outright is a little misleading, because that's kind of like saying Shakespeare was the bard. Sure, everybody knows who the bard is, but it doesn't really tell you anything. The same is true of Qumran. We know they lived there and they wrote stuff, but it doesn't tell us much about their beliefs or practices, let alone whether or not they were the mysterious authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, who were they? Well, it turns out we might have an answer. Or, at least we have a pretty good guess. Back in 2021, archaeologists announced that they had identified the administrative center of the Qumran community. This is important because it would be like discovering the center of operations for a modern religious community. Only instead of the headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have a bunch of buildings sitting on the edge of the Dead Sea. It turns out that these structures were more like a kibbutz than a monastery. If you're not familiar with a kibbutz, it's basically a type of communal farm, which makes Qumran more akin to an Israeli commune than a monastery. But there is one big difference. Unlike a modern kibbutz, which is a fairly recent invention, Qumran was founded sometime between the 3rd century BCE and the 2nd century CE. The fact that Qumran was a community dedicated to a communal way of life helps explain why we find things like this 4th century BCE ostracon that features a communal seal. But it also fits nicely with the description of the Essenes, an austere Jewish sect described by Roman-era writers. Those descriptions come from two main sources, the Roman historian Josephus Flavius and that Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria. For Josephus, the Essenes are just one of several Jewish sects alongside the Pharisees and Sadducees. He describes them as an ascetic sect, someone who practices severe self-discipline and isolation. In fact, he claims that they won't even speak to anyone except their closest family members. They live in small communities and earn their food through farming. They don't own any property and they don't keep any money. So there's no way they could enslave other people. Oh, and they only eat food that they grow themselves, which makes sense considering that we find tons of agricultural tools and evidence of farming at Qumran. And for Philo of Alexandria, the Essenes are an even bigger deal. Not only does he describe them as being similar to the Pythagorean Therapeuti, a mystery cult focused on healing and vegetarianism, but he also claims that they possess the most sacred writings, presumably the Torah and the books of the prophets. In fact, Philo describes them as spending their days in study, silence, and purification rituals, which sounds eerily familiar if you've ever visited Qumran. Of course, the parallels between Qumran and the Essenes are striking. Qumran was an isolated community of around 1,500 people living in the Judean desert. Its members worked as farmers, and they strictly followed the Torah and the books of the prophets. But none of this proves anything. Just because Qumran has many of the hallmarks of Essene life doesn't mean that they definitely lived there. It's possible that the Essenes and the people of Qumran are completely unrelated, but given the limited number of Jewish sects living in the region, it's unlikely, and we have further evidence that points towards them being one and the same. Remember that music box from the beginning of the video? Well, we also find evidence of music boxes at Qumran. There are tiny holes drilled into some of the pottery, which would have allowed for a string to be attached, turning the pot into a makeshift fiddle. Music is thought to have played a significant role in the community at Qumran. And we have further evidence for this in the form of a calendar found near the Dead Sea in the 1950s. It appears that each month was associated with a different type of musical instrument, meaning that music wasn't just something that happened at Qumran. It was a central feature of everyday life. This musical calendar was almost certainly created by the same people responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, making the Essenes a pretty good bet. But what about the actual scrolls? After all, it's not enough to prove that the Essenes were living at Qumran. We also need to show that they were the ones responsible for writing these mysterious documents. And right now, we have a few pieces of evidence pointing in that direction. For starters, there's the aforementioned musical quote from Philo of Alexandria, who claimed that the Essenes kept the most sacred writings and spent their days in prayer, meditation, and manual labor. Now, meditation may sound a bit off, especially considering the traditional image of the Stoic Essene. But for Philo, meditation was a major part of the spiritual life. In fact, he claimed that the Essenes had a special word for meditation, pneumatikos logoi, which literally translates to exercises of the spirit. This practice involved repeating certain phrases over and over again until the mind was purged of impurities. Some scholars argue that this practice is similar to the mental prayer techniques later developed by Christian monks. But for Philo, it was an essential part of daily life for every Essene, and we find further evidence for this at Qumran. One of the most common types of finds are ostraca, small pieces of pottery used for quick note-taking, and one of the most interesting ones dates back to the year 25 CE. It features what looks like a list of names, but the more you look at it, the more you realize that they aren't spelled out. Instead, they use a system of abbreviations and acronyms. And while it's too difficult to translate with any certainty, one possibility is that this list includes the names of the 12 original Essenes, which could indicate that Essene membership was limited to 12 people. This is consistent with the description of the Essenes as living in small communities, working as farmers and following a strict code of ethics, but it's still only circumstantial evidence. And we have one last piece of evidence before we wrap things up. Inside one of the Dead Sea Scrolls caves, archaeologists discovered a small pool, and nearby it a series of storage jars. This pool had already attracted attention because its construction was so advanced. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for them to find more pools like it at other sites throughout the region. This similarity suggests that they weren't unique to Qumran. And given that the Essenes were known to have built similar pools for ritual purification, it seems plausible that they're the ones responsible for this pool at Qumran. So, was Qumran just an Essene settlement, or were the Essenes the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, there are still some gaps in our knowledge. Nobody has definitively shown that the Essenes were directly involved in the creation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And, to be fair, there are other candidates, like a group known as the Therapeuti. But the evidence that we have does paint a pretty clear picture. There's too much overlap between the evidence for the Essenes and Qumran to ignore, and all signs point to the same conclusion. For my money, the Essenes are the Dead Sea Scrolls people. Thanks for watching. The Dead Sea Scrolls are arguably the most important collection of ancient texts ever discovered. They contain the oldest known copies of many books in the Old Testament, and they include a number of texts unique to the Jewish sect known as the Essenes. The problem is that when scholars tried to reconstruct what life was like for these mysterious holy men living out in the Judean desert, they ran into a few problems, and one of those problems was me. Hi, everyone. This is my channel. When I first started researching the Essenes, I had this impression of them as kind of the spiritual successors to the prophets, these pious desert hermits who fled the corruption of Temple Judaism and then hid away in the caves of Qumran where they wrote down their apocalyptic prophecies and then died, only to be discovered 2,000 years later by some goat herders with bad timing, except there's just one tiny problem with that story. The place they called Qumran doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible. In fact, it's not mentioned in any Jewish text from before the 20th century. It was only after archaeologists uncovered the settlement in 1947 that this place in the desert became synonymous with the Essenes. Even then, it took a while for that to catch on, because the archaeological evidence did not fit the picture that scholars had constructed. They expected to find a small town with a few houses and a synagogue containing the library of an ancient sect. But instead, they found a sprawling community with multiple compounds containing agricultural buildings, storehouses, workshops, residential quarters, and a ritual bath. There were no scrolls stored in a cave nearby, not until several more excavations were completed and other sites were discovered. But still, despite the fact that we've been excavating and studying this site for over 60 years now, it still hasn't yielded anything definitive. We still don't know if this was an Essene settlement, or even if it was inhabited by an ancient Jewish sect at all. So let's take a look at what we do know about Qumran, and what that means for our understanding of the Essenes. So here's the thing. The idea that the Dead Sea Scrolls came from a settlement at Qumran isn't actually that controversial. It's just that the exact nature of that settlement is highly debated. The name Qumran comes from the Arabic name for the area, which means the level place, and the place certainly has a bit of leveling going on. The site is situated in a low-lying area at the northern end of the Dead Sea, and it was likely chosen for that reason. You see, the surrounding mountains receive most of the rainfall in the region and funnel the water into the stream below, making it the perfect place to build an agricultural community. There were 2 settlements here during the Second Temple period, one at the higher elevation near the mouth of the wadi, and another down in the low-lying area beside the stream. By the Herodian period, both of these communities had been abandoned in favor of a single settlement closer to the middle. This settlement consisted of 5 major compounds divided between the northern and southern ends of the site. Most of the structures within these compounds were built from mud brick and stone, including several large halls and towers that acted as storehouses for food and supplies. These storehouses were originally thought to have contained the fabled Essene library, but there's very little evidence of any written material being stored at Qumran. The excavators did find an ostracon with an inscription of the Hebrew letter Shin, which could either be the person's name Shin or an abbreviation for script. They also found a few ostraca with numerical values written in Paleo-Hebrew script, which would have been used in accounting for the grain stores. Finally, there was the mikveh, a ritual bath building that was filled in during the Bar Kokhba revolt and contained a number of copper coins dating to the late Second Temple period. Archaeologists initially assumed that the coins were intentionally sealed in the mikveh as a symbolic act of purification after the destruction of the settlement. However, the most recent excavation suggests that this layer of coins was deposited by looters rather than the people who lived at Qumran. These people would have been aware that Roman soldiers were looting the settlement and were likely trying to hide their valuables in the floor of one of the rooms. The looters then dug up that room at a later date and accidentally covered over the coins in the process. If this is correct, then it lends credence to the theory that Qumran was not deserted in 70 CE, but was instead destroyed by a sudden military incursion. If that's true, then it might mean that Qumran was never an Essene settlement at all. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait a second, didn't we already learn that the Essene inhabited this site? Well, yes, but the reality is that none of the texts discovered at Qumran refer to the Essenes by that name. The term Essene only appears in non-Jewish texts, and it's thought to have originated as a disparaging term that referred to a particular sect of Jews. The earliest known use of the term comes from the first-century historian Philo, who refers to a group of therapeutai or healers who live a life of contemplation in the Judean wilderness. He describes them as men who, by abstaining from the lusts of the flesh and the desires of the eyes, have set their whole hope on the fear of the one who is invisible, practicing the law of the just and living according to his own proper place. This is pretty close to what we traditionally think of as an Essene, but it's not exactly what's described in the New Testament. When Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, Mark tells us that the heavens opened up, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and heard the voice saying, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Then immediately, the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. Here, Jesus fasted for 40 days and was tempted by Satan. This story makes it sound like the wilderness was a place of temptation and danger rather than a tranquil desert retreat. In fact, the image of the Essene living in caves and surviving off of wild plants and animals fits much closer to what we read in the Damascus document. This is one of the largest manuscripts found at Qumran, and it contains a number of sectarian writings, including one known as the Rule of the Community. The Rule of the Community lays out the laws and guidelines for living as a member of the sect. It covers everything from property ownership to sexual relations, and outlines the strict requirements for joining the community. According to this document, members of the sect must swear an oath of commitment and are forbidden from owning property, accepting gifts, or engaging in commerce. They must also avoid wine and eating meat, and must always remain chaste. These are the classic hallmarks of the Essene lifestyle as outlined by later Jewish historians. But that's not all. In a passage that sounds remarkably similar to Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, we read that the new member will live in the camp for 1 year and work alongside the other members without speaking a word. After 1 year, he will spend a second year working in the fields and gardens. At the beginning of the 3rd year, he will be tested to see if he can endure the hardships of the life of a wanderer. He will walk barefoot through the towns and villages carrying his staff and begging for food. This will prove whether he is ready to join the order of the Essenes. If he passes the test, he will be allowed to enter the order and receive instruction in their teachings. The Rule of the Community is a fascinating document that gives us insight into the rules and regulations of the sect. It seems to indicate that membership was by invitation only, and that new recruits had to prove themselves worthy over a 3-year period. It also demonstrates that the sect followed a kind of ascetic lifestyle and that they believed in separation from the broader society. The closest parallels to this type of lifestyle are the monastic orders that began emerging in the 3rd century CE, and the Essenes are sometimes referred to as the first monks of the desert. However, it's not clear if the author of this rule intended it as a guide for their entire sect or just for a small group of disciples. And that's one of the biggest obstacles standing in the way of understanding the Essenes. Almost everything we know about them comes from sources outside of their own writings. They left us with the Dead Sea Scrolls, a collection of biblical manuscripts and sectarian texts that shed light on their beliefs and practices. But they never referred to themselves as Essenes. They didn't write any historical accounts of their origins or their interactions with other Jewish groups. All we have are fragments of their daily life preserved in pottery, animal bones, and architectural remains, and so far nothing has definitively linked the inhabitants of Qumran to the Essenes. We simply don't know if this was an Essene settlement or what role the Essenes played in the destruction of the community. What we do know is that there is a lot we don't know, and that's what makes the Essenes such a fascinating subject to study. So, what do you think? Is Qumran an Essene settlement, or was it just a random community that was destroyed during the Great Revolt? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. And, as always, thank you so much for watching.